All right, so Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Gaza. Is China going to invade Taiwan? There's a bunch of coups in North Africa. It seems like the world's kind of on fire right now. And there's a lot of people speculating on what this could mean for the United States, what it could mean for the wider regions in which these conflicts are taking place. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to give everyone kind of a review of all of the major conflicts currently going on in the world. We're going to talk about best case scenarios, worst case scenarios, what specifically could mean for U.S. military personnel, and why you should care about it. Plus, if you stick with us at the end, once we've gone through the various conflicts that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to turn the show over to you and let you ask us to do on-the-spot analysis about the various conflicts that could be arising in the not-so-distant future. All of that and more coming up in this episode of Making the Argument, brought to you by Good Ranchers.
There's been so much going on, and I'm excited to get a handle on everything that's been going on around the world, but we would love to hear what you have to say at the end of this show when we do our Q&A section, but also in our community chat, which you can join by going to the link in the description. Put your name in there. We'd love to get to know you. We've got all these different channels outlined for different conversations. We'd love to have you there.
All right, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates for now, but other than that, a relatively good person. And just to give you a little bit of background for those that are tuning in for the first time, my background before I became a filthy politician was I served in the United States Army with the 82nd as an infantryman with the 82nd Airborne and the 25th Light Infantry Division. And then I also served as a Green Beret, more commonly, or actually Green Berets is the commonly known term. It's U.S. Army Special Forces, which heavily specializes in unconventional warfare, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, among other things, and did a couple of combat tours over in Iraq. So I'll be kind of drawing on some of that experience for our discussion today. My beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees, is not with us today, but our resident historian, political prognosticator, and mostly benevolent warlord in training, Christian Hines, will be with us today with extensive knowledge on military history across the globe that he's going to be able to bring to bear in this discussion.
Whoa, extensive knowledge.
Extensive historical knowledge.
I don't really think the wars of the Diadochi are going to help inform us about.
He's going to explain how Greek hoplites would have fought the war in Ukraine right now. And then, of course, our producer of producers, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking. How are you doing?
Nick, I'm doing great. This is going to be a good episode. I'm excited about it.
All right. Well, let's jump right into it. A couple of things that, again, like so much stuff has been going on. So many people are talking about all these various conflicts that are taking place with a lot of, dire predictions, and that's certainly appropriate to consider. But there's a couple things that we want to go over today in order to make sure that our audience feels comfortable kind of understanding what's going on, but also understanding the nature of the type of warfare that is going on. So a lot of this is conventional warfare. Some of it is a little bit more unconventional. Some of it is combating terrorism. A lot of what they call asymmetric warfare. We'll be able to kind of explain what that means as we talk about various conflicts where we see it taking place. And we're also going to go through something that I think is really important. There are a lot of people that review various militaries across the world, and they conduct what I call kind of the bean counter or the Excel spreadsheet approach to military analysis, which is to say that they will compare the military strengths of two nations and then come to various conclusions about who would win in a conflict. And there's this common saying when we discuss military strategy, and it's something like good commanders think about or what is it? Mediocre commanders think about tactics, good commanders think about strategy, and great commanders think about logistics. And you're going to see that in some of our analysis today where we probably come to some conclusions, and Christian and I might have some disagreement on this, but I'm certainly going to come to some conclusions that I would say go against the grain on some of the typical analysis on these issues. And I'm not talking about the analysis that you find in a think tank that is dedicated to this. I'm talking about some of the popular cultural analysis that we see within Twitter, the Twitter sphere. And we're going to, again, kind of help everyone explain or help everyone understand why we come to these conclusions. But first things first, we're going to go ahead and dive into the war in Ukraine. Obviously, this has been the conflict that has probably gotten the most attention of Western audiences for quite some time right now. It might be a little bit different if you're in other parts of the world where other conflicts are going on. But obviously, Russia and Ukraine has consumed a lot of information and a lot of attention from the media, not simply because of it being arguably probably the first time in recent history where you've had a major Western power invade another Western power, ostensibly to simply annex the property, right? To simply annex territory. Wars have kind of conquests like that have been far less common in recent world history than they were in the past. And in fact, that in and of itself is interesting. In fact, Rudyard on What If Alt His was talking about how we kind of have this notion now ever since World War II that wars of aggression for purposes of conquest are just not a thing that really happens anymore, or things that other countries should automatically have a duty or responsibility to intervene in order to stop. And that really kind of has been the predominant theory within the West. And so to have Russia, it started off with, you can make some arguments with respect to their operations in Georgia, certainly their operations in Crimea. They've been one of the most aggressive Western powers when it comes to invading for the purpose of actually annexing territory. Because I can already hear people say, oh, you say that as an American. I seem to recall this thing called Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, last time I checked, we didn't take any territory from Iraq and Afghanistan that is now, legal U.S. territory at this point. What Russia's talking about taking, what they took in Crimea, they're keeping. What they're taking in Ukraine, they intend to keep. So that's the difference that I'm trying to demonstrate in the types of warfare that people can actually engage in. But I want to go back to some early analysis that Christian and I did. We did a Y-Minute on the invasion of Ukraine. We did a couple different podcasts about it. I did a lot of reels on it. And I want to give Christian a pat on the back, and I think the show a pat on the back, because early on, when it was looking like Russia was going to have this thing rolled up relatively quickly, we were one of the outlets that was saying, not so quick. They have a couple of conditions that if they don't meet very quickly, and this was about 3 weeks into the war when everything was kind of going Russia's way, and it was if they don't seal the deal, like within the next 30 days, within the next 60 days, Russia's actually going to have some huge problems on its hands. And we had a lot of people that were looking at us going, well, you're an idiot. I mean, that's clearly not going to happen. Look at the military disparities between Ukraine and Russia. Look at the population disparities. They got it in the bag. And so we've got a map here of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is showing different levels of Russian advance within Ukraine. And yeah, on the opening days, just absolute, complete, and total mismatch. Not to mention the fact that there are wide sectors of Ukraine, to include some of the occupied areas within the Donbass region, Crimea, etc., where you do have a lot of people that are either ethnic Russians or they closely align themselves with Russia, or let's say that when Ukraine was making political decisions on which side was it going to closely align itself with. Was Ukraine going to be clearly within the Russian sphere of influence, or was it going to be within the NATO and maybe the EU sphere of influence? And there was elections that took place in Ukraine, and obviously everybody over there was accusing the other side of stealing their elections. But there was elections in Ukraine where they had a pro-Russian government that was essentially ousted, and then you had a pro-West government that came in under Zelensky. And we all know that there was a lot of corruption issues. There was issues within the Donbass with the population over there. Once again, a lot of discussions about whether or not various elections that were being held at the local level were illegitimate. The Russian military, its casus belli, right? Its reason for going to war was to protect ethnic Russians and other people living in the Donbass region, which they claimed were being abused by the Ukrainian government, and which, for all rights and purposes, both ethnic, geographically, historically, should belong as part of Russia rather than Ukraine, or at the very least should exist as potentially as an independent state. So that was the casus belli going in. And when they first went in, they just completely overwhelmed the Ukrainian military. And part of what they did was they launched multiple operations from multiple fronts, first taking the Donbass with the assistance of many people that live in the Donbass region, but then also making a run for Kyiv pretty quick in the north, which ended up faltering. And one of the things that we kind of assessed as we were looking at this early on was that their initial military advance was very impressive. Ukraine is ripe for offensive warfare, especially armored warfare in certain parts of the country.
That's where some of the largest tank battles in history have taken place, is in Ukraine.
Yeah. So it was very well suited to the military mismatch between the Ukrainian military and the Russian military. Russian military had significantly more armor, significantly more air power. more troops, everything. Like if you're just looking at the Excel spreadsheet, the Russian military was far superior to the Ukrainian military. Especially with respect to the quantity of materials. Their military equipment actually wasn't, I wouldn't say there was a huge mismatch in the quality of the equipment necessarily, because Ukrainians used a lot of
well, we had been supplying them equipment since 2014.
The javelins and things like that were created a significant, can we bring that map back up? Thanks. Created a significant disparity.
Yeah.
But again, we were looking at a place where from the quality of equipment, there wasn't a huge mismatch. From the quantity of equipment, it was night and day. It was night and day.
And you know what they say? Quantity has a quality of its own.
Yeah. There's a certain quality to be found in quantity. But I remember we said fairly early on that a couple of things had to happen. So the Ukrainian military, for Russia to win this in a timely manner, the Ukrainian military had to effectively be destroyed. And one of the other things that we said was Zelensky needed to kind of leave the country. Maybe not abdicate, right? But leave the country in such a way to where it appeared to the Ukrainian people that, if the president doesn't have any faith in your ability to actually win this war, to where they're fleeing the country, that's a morale crusher, absolute morale crusher. And so ostensibly what we said was, okay, Zelensky has to, stay strong, stay within the country. I mean, it's not that he couldn't travel at all, but stay within the country. He needs to convince the Western powers to be able to come in significantly. And the Ukrainian military has to stay intact, right? If there's some nucleus of the Ukrainian military in order to rally around in some area of the country that hasn't completely fallen, for which the West can easily resupply, then the Ukrainians are not only going to be able to pull this off, but they're going to be able to push back. And part of the reason for that is because the Russian advance was so quick that they started to outstrip their logistical supply lines. This is where we go into logistics.
That wouldn't have been an issue though if it weren't for a good friend of mine, former boss actually, Andrew Quello once told me that, and I agree with him on this, that arguably the most important battle at the very, very beginning of the invasion was the Battle of the Hostomel Airport, which is an airport just outside of Kyiv.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have kind of forgotten about it because it only lasted a few days. But in many respects, that kind of sealed the fate of the idea that Russia would be able to steamroll the country very, very quickly in a lightning campaign of just a few days or a few weeks. Because the VDV, Russia's airborne assault troops, they dropped in and they actually managed to take the Hostomel airport for about a day or two.
Yeah.
But then they were overwhelmed when the Ukrainians sent in reinforcements to drive them out. Completely wiped them out, drove the survivors into the woods.
Yeah, when their armored forces were, because they were relying on, a proper airborne operation is you don't just jump in paratroopers and then, okay, guys, you got this, right? You secure an airfield so that follow-on forces can also come in. And then ideally in a situation like this, what it is you're dropping airborne forces behind enemy lines on a strategic objective, which provides you the ability to resupply.
And that's exactly what the Russians did.
At the same time that your armored units are crossing overland in order to link up. So what you're doing is you're creating a second front for the defending forces to have to reallocate resources. Well, the problem was they did that, and we saw this in World War II with the bridge too far.
I was about to bring up a bridge too far. Operation Market. This was Russia's Market Garden in many respects, and the same result happened. Right, Market Garden was a failure because they could not link up all those bridges.
Yeah.
And so Market Garden disintegrated once the Germans counterattacked.
It's funny, they said it was like 70% effective, which means it wasn't.
Which means it failed. Yeah. And so the failure of the Russians to take and then hold the Hostomel airport and then use that as a means to resupply the entire front that was coming down from Belarus to try to take the capital meant that Kiev couldn't be surrounded, encircled, and taken by the Russians. And the failure to take the capital basically meant the failure of the maneuver phase of the campaign. The Russians eventually pulled back entirely from the north, and then it slowly turned into attrition. Now it's funny. The war started off as a World War II style. Yeah. I don't necessarily like to use the phrase blitzkrieg. I actually wrote a paper about this when I was getting my master's, it's actually more the old Prussian doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, which is maneuver warfare. But like it started off like that. It started off like a campaign that like Moltke would have drafted, and now it's devolved into like World War I style trench warfare.
Well, and the reason for that, and one of the things that anybody was doing that was watching that had like military experience or had studied history was realizing that because the Russians were outrunning their supply lines, because they had left a pockets of urban resistance in the rear, right, where those same supply lines where people would have to go and restore troops at the front, what was going to happen was an asymmetric problem. So when we talk about asymmetric warfare, what we're doing is we're saying when one force clearly can't match the conventional power of another one, they start to look for areas where they have advantages against what might be considered a superior power on paper. And here's the issue. Urban warfare is incredibly difficult. Urban warfare can give a huge advantage to the defender, especially when you're talking about a defender that knows the area that they're fighting much better than the offensive troops which are currently occupying it. So if you haven't actually cleared out resistance within a particular area and properly secured it, well, now every building, every sewer system, every alleyway, everything can be a thing. Everything can be some place where somebody can hide with an RPG, with an AT-4, with a Javelin anti-tank weapon, which is a highly advanced anti-tank weapon, and they can just start destroying your armored forces. And you need to understand that what ends up happening is you have to start deploying. If you're the one conducting the offensive war, you have to repeatedly deploy more troops just to support your supply line to the front lines. And so now, instead of getting to deploy all those troops to the front in order to fight the Ukrainian military, instead what you're having to do is protect these long supply lines through some pretty dangerous urban areas and other places that are easy for a defender to take advantage of it because they can strike anywhere they want. You have to now string out more and more and dedicate more and more resources, not to offensive operations against the main body, but against little pockets of resistance along the whole line. And that does a huge amount to drain your resources, not to mention the fact that it's a huge morale killer. When you're getting soldiers picked off, one tank at a time, a couple of troops at a time, an ambush here, an ambush there, that becomes incredibly frustrating, especially for the commanders that are trying to fight in what you would call like the main effort, because now they're not getting supplies, they're not getting ammunition in a timely manner. And so what ends up happening? Well, if they can't secure out their supply lines, they have to start consolidating forces, and then they have to start moving back to supply lines that they can actually defend. And that's where you saw kind of the collapse of that original offensive just happen, is that it would have worked could they have, let's say, surrounded major pockets of the Ukrainian military and destroyed it, or put them in a position where they could have easily destroyed them, taken Kyiv and essentially forced Zelensky out of the country. They very well could have gone into a position where Western powers would have thought to themselves, this thing's lost. We're just sorry, Ukraine, but you're going to have to come up with some sort of negotiated settlement because there's no one for us to send weapons to. Like, this is why we said it was so important that the Ukrainian military at this point just had to exist. It just had to stay alive. Think about the American Revolution, right? If you look at the American Revolution and you just chalk up battles won and battles lost, dude, we were in a hard place for most of the American Revolution. But Washington kept the Continental Army intact. And the end result was that there was always a nucleus to build around. There was always a reason to be able to convince other countries, in our case it was France, to be able to deploy resources, weapons, material, money, because we had an army in the field that could challenge Britain. Right? Same thing here. As long as the Ukrainian military stayed intact, as long as there was semblance of a Ukrainian government, there was someone to give money to. There was someone to give military equipment to. And so I've said this before, and people got mad at me when I said it. I said, look, if you want to talk about probably one of the best wartime leaders in the last 30, 40 years, you would have to include political leaders. You'd have to include Zelensky. People are like, how dare you? Don't you know how corrupt he is? Don't you know how this he is? Don't you know? Yeah. And I didn't say I want him to be president of the United States. I didn't say I want to build statues to him. I didn't say I want to give him the Nobel Peace Prize.
You didn't say I admire him.
I didn't say I want him to date my daughter. I said that his job as the president of Ukraine at that time was to keep his country in the war and then convince the West to send billions of dollars worth of equipment,
over $100 billion at this point,
so he could keep fighting it, because there was no way Ukraine could have kept fighting without that. So let me ask you a question, regardless of how you feel about Zelensky, regardless of how you feel about the war. Has he done that? Yes. There's no question he's done that. I mean, if you want to be if you want to be mad about something, then go ahead and be mad at the other people, but Zelensky has done exactly what we would have expected the leader of our country to do if our country had been suddenly invaded.
I mean, if you should be mad at anyone, you should be mad at Joe Biden for continuing to send tens of billions. I mean, at this point, like $100 billion of American financial support to a country thousands of miles away from us and spend effectively nothing on defending our own borders. This is the argument that conservatives in the U.S. have made now for quite a while, that why are we sending all of this money or equipment? I know that it's not just piles of cash. A lot of it is military equipment, but why are we sending all of this support to secure the borders of a country that borders Russia, literally in another continent, half a world away from us, and we're doing nothing to stop the quasi invasion of our own country and stop the porous border that we have in the South? And it's a legitimate criticism. It's definitely legitimate criticism. It's also one that I agree with. I've come out many times before and said I don't think we should be giving I don't think we should be giving foreign aid to all these countries around the world, especially when we're running multi-trillion-dollar annual deficits. So I'm with conservatives on that, but there's a difference between taking a policy position on that and ignoring the fact that, like, from the perspective of the Ukrainians, Zelensky has done his job. We might be upset as conservatives that he might have done his job a little bit too well.
Yeah.
Right? But so...
Well, let me put it this way. Two things can be true at once. I can look at the war in Ukraine and I can say, look, I think on the whole, I'm not a fan of. I've never been a fan. I've always thought Putin's government was ultimately hostile to the United States and still something of a strategic threat. I'm not a fan of the Ukrainian government either, because it's just steeped in absolute corruption. But I can also look at this and be like, yeah, I want Ukraine to win this, because I still don't think Russia was justified in what they did. I think it's destabilizing, not just to the region. I think it's bad precedent when a country is allowed to invade another one and just take land. I think that's a dangerous precedent.
Are we allowed to have a little bit of back and forth debate in this episode?
No, of course we are.
No debate.
Of course we are.
I would love to briefly.
I'm just saying, I want Ukraine to win the war. It's not that I was totally against any assistance whatsoever.
No, I get that.
But I never wanted U.S. land forces to be involved. I never wanted us to be directly involved in military engagements. And my big problem was I've gotten really, really tired of a lot of European countries, not all of them, right? But a lot of European countries that have taken this kind of arrogant attitude toward the United States, that we're the bull in the china shop. We're just this big brute, and why can't we be more sophisticated like them and only spend and not live up to our NATO obligations and not spend the money that we're supposed to by treaty spend on our own defense forces? Why couldn't we just put it all into large social welfare programs like they did? Well, now all of a sudden, Russia is flexing its muscles once again, and Europe is relying on the United States to save a country which we are not obligated by treaty to save or to support. They're not in NATO. They're not in the, if anybody was going to actually step up and try to be a leader on the world stage right now, countries like Germany and France, here's your opportunity. You're both in NATO, right? Okay, you're both part of the EU. This is your, theoretically, if you wanted to talk about the EU sphere of influence, because a part of the reason why this war started is because NATO wanted to agree to not include Ukraine. And so here's my question. Germany, larger GDP than Russia, and it ain't close. I think Germany's got something like twice the GDP of Russia.
It's in the top 5.
Yeah, France has a higher GDP than Russia. The EU has a GDP something like not quite 10 times greater than Russia, but it's significantly larger, like multiple orders of magnitude larger.
The EU collectively has a GDP that's like almost the size of the US's.
So here's the question. Why'd they need us? Right? Aren't we the big brutes? Aren't they wanting us to sit down and shut up and not be the global hegemon? Like, this would have been a perfect opportunity for them to be able to demonstrate that Europe can take care of Europe. But here we are. So there's my little rant on that.
I mean, everybody wants to hate on America until, until they need Americans to open up their checkbooks.
Yeah, that toxic American masculinity
all
came
these
in real
European
handy.
welfare states living off of the teat of the American taxpayer in order to subsidize their own defense, because none of them actually want to spend a cent on defense, except for Poland, because Poland's incredibly based. But
I love this real quick. Emerald Advance. This guy is completely deluded on the Russia-Ukraine war. No explanation given of that. I'm just completely deluded because he says so.
Okay,
this is so common in the comments section.
Here's the debate that I want to have with you briefly. I actually think, and this is controversial, but I think you'll know where I'm going with this. I actually think Russia's invasion was entirely justified. I don't think that it was morally correct. I don't think it's morally correct for countries to invade each other. Sure. But I actually think it was entirely justified. And the reason why is because Ukraine had a presidential election in 2010. Mm-hmm. And who was it? It was Victor, I cannot remember his last name. But anyway, the pro-Russian candidate that had overwhelming support from the Donbass, overwhelming support from Crimea, overwhelming support from the Odessa area, which is actually where my great-grandmother was born. Overwhelming support from the South and East. Pro-Russian candidate. He won the election. And by the way, it was a fair and square election. This was an election that had like international observers. Yeah. Because there were a lot of concerns that it might have been rigged because Ukraine was notorious for corruption, still is. But the pro-Russian candidate won. It was very close, extremely geographically divided, but he did win. And it was a legitimate, fair, square election. He was sworn in entirely through the legal process. And he decided to do a change in policy. He said, and he campaigned on this, he said, I want to cultivate closer relations with our largest neighbor that's right on our border that historically has shared a history and culture with us for 1,000 years. Yeah. And he signed an agreement with the Russian government to basically integrate Ukraine's economy closer to Russia. They signed a bunch of free trade deals. Ukraine started pivoting more towards wanting to integrate itself into Russia's version of the EU that it has with some of these Central Asian countries. And Russia reciprocated by signing an agreement with the Ukrainian government to provide them like literally free natural gas and oil. So it was actually a great deal economically for the Ukrainian government, at least for a Ukrainian government that was sympathetic to Russia. Yeah. And the response was a revolution in Kiev. Yeah. Or Kyiv, right? A revolution in the Ukrainian capital, which was very pro-Western. Yeah. And you saw Western activists from the EU, hang on, to wrap it up, the Euromaidan in 2014, supported by Western actors in the European Union, overthrowing a legitimately democracy, democratically elected president, simply because he had a policy change where he wanted to orient his country more towards Russia rather than the EU. And where were the democracy advocates? This is very dangerous for our democracy. Where were those people when a legitimately elected president is overthrown in what is basically a coup d'etat?
Well, here's my question. I'm not, so I can look at all of that and say, okay, I understand the argument that you're making. Here's what I'll say. This whole idea, like when Kings and Generals, which is a YouTube channel that I typically really enjoy, they always start off things with like the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Okay, I don't agree with that characterization of Russia going in. Again, I will go with I don't think Russia had sufficient justification to invade Ukraine, because even what you just said, I can understand why Russia would be mad. I can understand why Russia would want to do something about it. I don't think that justifies full-scale military invasion of a country because you don't like the way their elections turned out, or you don't like the way that their own internal political arrangements worked out, even if you think it's illegitimate, right? Like I don't think that's justifiable. It would be one thing if a coup d'etat took over Ukraine and they started shelling Russia, but that's not what happened. So I think two things can be true at once here. I think you can look at anybody that's saying that Russia had no reason to invade Ukraine. I don't think that's an accurate depiction of what actually happened. I don't think it was a justifiable reason. And somebody asked a question on here. I want to get to this because this is an important one. They said, where is it? They asked the question about, let me see, is Ukraine being used? No. I don't know. Maybe we'll find it. I'll try to find it later here. But they were asking a question about whether or not, I would support Ukraine joining NATO. And the answer to that is no. Like one of the things that makes me mad about this entire episode is that the United States and NATO, there were various things that were done that provoked Russia that didn't need to be done. Okay, Ukraine, there's no real reason for Ukraine to be in NATO. In fact, if you look at the whole superstructure of NATO right now, there's a lot of people that question why it even still exists, especially when many of the several quote unquote largest members of NATO don't even live up to their own treaty obligations under NATO. And so I think all of those are fair questions for people to ask and people to have. But no, I think we could have ended a lot of this by simply assuring Russia that NATO, which again was a military alliance that was set up as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, right? You had NATO and the Warsaw Pact. I think it would have been perfectly acceptable to assure, Russia that no, we're not looking to add Ukraine into a military alliance, which essentially, brings NATO all the way to your border. I mean, it's technically already on Russia's border, but this would have been a significant shift from what we have previously thought of as the various spheres of influence. And so, no, in that sense, I do think Russia was provoked. I don't think it was sufficient to justify a full-on invasion, but I also think it is.
I'm not endorsing.
I know. I think it's totally. Well, you said justified. That's why I'm disagreeing. I don't think justified.
He had a casus belli, is what I'm trying to argue.
Yeah, sure.
And
sure.
Now, whether or not you want to say that casus belli is morally justifiable, I'm with you. I don't think it's morally just. I do not think it's shocker. I don't really think this is a very controversial statement, but we'll say it. I don't think it's morally justifiable to bomb cities in a foreign country because you want to take land from that country.
Yeah.
But the idea that Putin just woke up one day and said, "I think I'm going to invade Ukraine today."
That's
not what happened.
No. And again, I think that's part of whenever wars take place, both sides engage in propaganda. Both sides do. And what part of Western propaganda has been, oh my God, why would he do this? It must be that he's just wants Ukraine. Like, well, no, there were reasons why from Putin's position. And a lot of times I think in the West, in the United States, sometimes we look at it as like, well, but we wanted to engage in offensive military actions to steal territory. Like we wanted to invade Russia without cause. And Putin's looking at that going, yeah, I don't buy it. Like, I don't buy that you wouldn't use Ukraine as a staging ground to diminish the influence or the power or the economic prowess of Russia. And so it's not hard to imagine why someone in Putin's position could go down the rabbit hole of developing a various reasons and justifications for doing what he did. I don't agree with it. I think there's a lot of things the West could have done that would have mitigated this. And I think that would have been far better for both Russia and Ukraine. But the West did the worst possible thing, and the United States specifically did the worst possible thing it could have. It didn't acknowledge that Ukraine probably shouldn't have a place in NATO. There was no strategic military advantage to us. There was no defensive military advantage to NATO by having Ukraine. All it did was provoke Russia. Russia saw it as a threat, and it wasn't an unreasonable thing for them to assume that. So we didn't do that. We didn't concede that, okay, yeah, hey, that's great. We're going to maybe EU, maybe trade, but not military. Not military. We don't need to do that. We didn't do that. At the same time that Biden projected the worst possible weakness that he possibly could have with respect to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And look, I wanted us to pull out of Afghanistan. I didn't want us to pull out the way we did because that was absurd. That was ridiculous. But he projected indecisiveness and weakness. And so
at the same time that we're provoking them.
Yes.
We're making ourselves look weak at the same time that we're provoking them, and then we're stunned when tanks roll across the border. And I remember, people on the left mocking the idea that Russia could invade Ukraine, and yet here we are. Almost 2 years into the war.
Well, and here's the deal. Getting back to what we were talking about before with respect to, okay, why did Russia advance so quickly, and then why did they fall back, and where are we at right now, and how do we think this is going to end? Again, they advanced quickly because they have overwhelming military superiority. The terrain within Ukraine is actually very, very conducive to armored warfare because there's a lot of flat farmland. There's not as many natural barriers as you would find in other parts of Europe, and so it was conducive to that sort of fast warfare. However, you let your supply lines grow too far, you don't secure those supply lines, and now you're going to have to constantly reallocate forces. It's bad for morale. It's costly. It takes away from your main efforts at the front. And then ultimately, you end up having to fall back in order to shore up those supply lines. And one of the most important things you can understand about supply lines is if you want to secure your supply line for the best poultry, meat, pork, wild-caught seafood, you go to Good Ranchers. See? Good Ranchers is the key in just about all of these questions about logistics and supply lines, because you never want to find yourself in a situation that I know a lot of us did when you walk into grocery stores or you walk into other places, and then all of a sudden your supply line to the foods that you need to keep your family healthy are just not there because the government decided to shut things off, right? You want to be able to look at alternatives to not only be able to get what you need to feed your family, but also to get the best quality stuff possible. And that's what Good Ranchers does. They team with American farmers. When they say raised in the USA, it was raised in the USA. Most people don't know that a lot of the beef that they're getting, a lot of the pork that they're getting, a lot of the food that they're getting, it might say in the USA, but that just might have been, I crossed over and went through a processing plant, right? Good Ranchers doesn't play those sort of word games. They actually they team up with good American farmers that are raising a quality product, and then they make sure that it gets directly to your door. And if you use promo code Nick, you can get $25 off, you can get free shipping, and you can sign up for one of their subscriptions, which also carries a certain degree of inflation proof.
It does.
You can get locked into a price for up to 2 years with one of their subscriptions.
You can pause it
when you need to, turn it back on when you need to. You can set it up based off of the monthly system that you want. So it is an excellent way for you to be able to get on one of those menus and just know that the steak, the poultry, the pork, the bacon, the wild-caught seafood, it is showing up on your door right when it's supposed to. That's Good Ranchers' commitment, and they do an excellent job of it.
For our audio listeners, we've left a link in the description for you that you can use. But if there's any time that you've heard us talk about Good Ranchers and you would like to help the show, today is the day to do it. So I hope you all use the link in the description, use promo code Nick, and let's do it.
All right, so Good Ranchers, once again, thank you for being logistical geniuses. All right.
Do we move on to the next conflict?
Well, we got one more thing we're going to say, and that's the predictions for how it's going to end. So I want to pull something up here on and this kind of goes like the offensive and Ukraine kind of coming back. So obviously, the West has been pouring very, very highly sophisticated armor, highly sophisticated aircraft. Early on, it was the anti-tank stuff. Javelin anti-tank missiles are just those things are awesome. I'm just going to tell you right now, those things are awesome. But they were just pouring that in there, and that gave the Ukrainians something of an asymmetric advantage from a defensive perspective. But in order to launch offensive capabilities, you need things like heavy armor, you need mechanized vehicles, you need aircraft. And so the West has been providing more and more of that in order to ostensibly help Ukraine be able to launch an effective offensive. Now, here's what's happened. I'm going to give you guys some numbers. So from September 6th to September 13th, the offensive was called and I always screw up these names, you can correct me, the Kharkiv. That was Ukraine launching a counteroffensive against Russia. It was considered Russia had a hasty defense.
This was last year,
yeah,
right?
This is last year, 2022, and they were gaining about 7,400 meters per day.
That was a lightning offensive.
That is a lightning offensive. That's
and
massive.
For our viewers on YouTube, the Kharkiv offensive, this is formerly known as Kharkov, a very famous city because of World War II. There were 3 massive battles that were fought in Kharkov during World War II. The city changed hands multiple times between the Nazis and the Soviets. That is the part of the country that's in blue that's right on the border with the Donbass. So not the super northern part near Belarus where Kiev is, but it's about right there.
Yeah.
And that was a offensive that the Russians were not prepared, just to the north of that, Hamilton. Yeah, that was an offensive the Russians were not prepared for at all, and it shows because the defense just disintegrated in a matter of weeks.
You also had from August 29th to November 11th, so this was going on roughly the same time in 2022, but it was going on around Kherson. The Russians were more prepared for that offensive. That was making 590 meters per day, which is not horrible, but it ain't great. June 4th to August 28th of 2023. That's the Robotyne offensive. The Russians were fully fortified, 90 meters a day. Right, so that's like this is World War I. The
Surovikin line is not to be trifled with.
Yeah, to give you an idea, that's the same sort of advance that the French and Great Britain were making against the Germans in the Somme.
I was about to say this is it resembles the Somme because they are making it like if Hamilton, it's going to be hard to do it, but if you were to zoom in near Zaporizhia, I know that might be hard to locate.
Can you point to that for me?
In the south,
kind of that south light blue area, yeah.
1 second.
Sorry.
Oh, actually, I've got a more high res map that I can.
We don't need to do that because we got to do this and we got to move on to our next conflict. So, here's what I want people to understand is, and Christian, back me up, because when the U.S. had agreed to send over Abrams tanks, the Germans had sent over Leopard tanks, and to give you an idea, Abrams tanks outclasses anything, even the older export models, still outclasses anything the Russians have. Right, I would argue that the Leopards probably outclass most, if not all, of what the Russians had in Ukraine. So they were given highly sophisticated armor that was better than what their opposition had. They were also given aircraft, among other things, artillery and whatnot that was all, I would argue, probably superior to what the Russian military was using at this stage in the war. And there was a lot of anticipation and there was a lot of expectation that Ukraine was going to launch an offensive and, continue to make significant gains. And what they're kind of trying to do right now is cut off the southern portion of Ukraine that is currently being held by Russia, along with Crimea, from the rest of Russia. Because if they can do that, they can get into a very, very good strategic position for negotiating. That didn't happen. They're still making some gains, but I remember we were talking about this early on, and I told Christian, I said, I don't think this offensive is going anywhere.
This was like back in August or September when it looked like that they were about to break, because the Surovikin line had has three defensive lines. The Ukrainians broke through the first one, and there was an expectation that, number 2 and 3 will fall very quickly because they are less well defended, less well constructed than the first one. And it simply didn't happen. And in part because the Russians actually laterally deployed many of their professional troops. There's a lot of conscripts in Ukraine right now, but the Russians do have some professional soldiers that had been part of the Russian military before the invasion. They're not 18-year-old boys that were just called up yesterday. Like, for example, they deployed a lot of VDV units, and the VDV, to their credit, I think that they kind of got underestimated by a lot of people because they had been wiped out at the Hostomel airport a year earlier, but the ones that were laterally redeployed to like Robotyne or the Zaporizhia front basically have managed to hold the line pretty well.
Airborne troops in most militaries typically have a reputation for falling within the specialized area, and it's not just because of the airborne capability. It's largely because of other training that they go through and kind of what's necessary for airborne training. So when I was in the 82nd Airborne Division, the reason why that was a good unit was not simply because it was rapid deployment, but once you have to train forces to deploy into an area where you could get separated in the air as you're dropping, you could be going into a hot LZ. When you train and prepare for that, it creates a certain degree of, I would say, resilience and initiative within the troops, within airborne troops, because they have to train for an airborne scenario. A lot of that training is relevant, even if they don't deploy in an airborne scenario. So they tend to fight well. They tend to be better equipped. They tend to actually go through more training than a lot of your typical infantry units, especially in foreign countries. And so as a result, they end up being crack troops, even if they're not being used in that specific method of infill, which is.
So how do you think it's going to end? To wrap up Ukraine.
All right.
Here.
So the offensive is still going along, but it's very, very slow, and we're about to hit winter. And I don't know how effectively the Ukrainian military is going to be able to fight in this, because the point that I made before is like, you can give someone all the equipment you want, but none of them are trained on this equipment. And I obviously they receive some training, like a lot of this training is going on in Poland and other areas in Europe. But there's a big difference between training someone on this is how you load the main gun, this is how you use the equipment, this is how you fire it, and actually being skilled and adept at using that specific equipment in combined arms or maneuver warfare, right? So you don't just put someone in a tank and say, go forth and do great things. You have a tank supported by infantry, supported by artillery, supported by air cover. That's your combined arms operations. I said they don't have air superiority. And the same asymmetric problem with respect to defense toward armor is going to start to kick in here, because the Russian military still has anti-tank equipment, because that's relatively cheap, and they have drone capability. And so what's going to end up happening is, without air superiority, you're going to still have to drudge along slowly, removing mines, removing tank traps. It's going to cause you to, people look at this sometimes like, well, all they have to do is break through one area. That's what these defensive structures are designed to do. They're designed to channel you into a particular area where now the defense can concentrate all of its firepower in a relatively small spot. And so that's why you've seen it go from 700 or 7,400 meters a day to 590 meters a day to 90 meters a day. And the problem at this point is, the West is the country that's pushing Ukraine to get an offensive because they want this to end. Their own populations are getting frustrated with this. So here's what I think. And I'm going to stick with the prediction that I made before. And again, this got people mad because it was almost like they said, because you made this prediction, that's what you want to happen. No, I'm making this prediction because based off of what I'm seeing on the ground, what I'm seeing within the various governments of the countries involved, is I think this is a potential outcome that you could see. I think you're going to get some sort of settled peace negotiation. I don't think Russia's not losing Crimea. I know Zelensky has now said that getting Crimea back to Ukraine is going to happen. I don't think that's happening. I don't think Russia's going to keep the Donbass. I think what's going to end up happening is some sort of maybe agreed upon international referendum to allow Donbass to take maybe an internal vote, which doesn't totally separate them from Ukraine, but maybe comes up with kind of like a federalist style area where they have a lot of maybe local autonomy. I could see something like that going on. I think Russia is going to have to settle for that. I think that what's going to end up happening is Zelensky, who for the last several months has been like, we will take back all of Ukraine to include Crimea, which had, kind of been, that ship has sailed, I think. I don't think they have the military force to do it. The West is getting tired of throwing money into Ukraine. Ukraine hasn't been able to launch an effective offensive, which has demonstrated or signaled to Western countries that this war could theoretically be over this year, or at least put the Ukrainians in an incredibly powerful position to negotiate. I think what ends up happening is you end up with certain settlements that we probably could have agreed to before this war ever started, which would have, satiated some of Russia's concerns. I think Zelensky, in order to walk back his statements about, totally kicking Russia out and taking everything back, I think they probably offer him like the Peace Prize. And people got mad at me when I said, you think he deserves. It's not about what I think he deserves. It's about what I think they will do. They're going to promise him a massive aid package to rebuild Ukraine, and they're going to promise him some, international notoriety with respect to something like the Nobel Peace Prize. And then I think Putin has to pull his forces back, and then I think Putin has major political concerns on his front, because I don't care how you swing this. It would probably be wise for both nations, and certainly for the people that are dying right now, to come up with some sort of negotiated settlement where Putin's going to have to at least come up with something that he can save face. But I think long term, this potentially spells real internal problems for Putin. We already saw that with Prigozhin and Wagner
rebellion.
Yeah, because I honestly thought when
that
I
was
first
so stupid
when that first happened, you know what I honestly thought? I was like, if the Russians are playing this right, what they're doing right now is they're creating a psyop so that they can redeploy forces.
Just turns out that
he was a dumbass.
Pure chaos.
Just an idiot.
And then Prigozhin ignored the number one rule of power politics, which is if you aim for the king, you better not miss, and you better not turn around and walk away.
Oh my! The moment they redeployed,
I predicted that he would be assassinated within 24 hours of him striking that agreement. I've got the receipts to show it.
When they diverted them to Belarus, I said, see, here it is. They just managed to get away with deploying like 25,000 troops or whatnot to Belarus to once again open up another front.
Nope.
It just
turns out that they're all idiots.
He died in a plane accident. I'm like, I'm surprised it took that long.
Died in a plane accident. Yeah.
He
plane was
died
blown
of COVID.
out of the sky. Yeah, he died.
Plane caught COVID.
He should have taken the booster.
Yeah. that was Pfizer's psyop on that. Like, we told him.
I remember, I've got the receipts to show it. I remember publicly predicting the day after the rebellion ended that like Prigozhin has just made the worst mistake of his entire life, and he did. So yeah, I honestly I believe it or not, I actually have a more concise ending than Nick does for once on how I think Ukraine will end. I think it'll end in a frozen conflict. And frozen conflicts, there's so many all over the world. In fact, there's one right across the border from Ukraine in Transnistria with Moldova. But like a perfect example of a frozen conflict is the Korean Peninsula. Technically no peace treaty. There's a demarcation line. You have the DMZ, you know, the armistice line from the 1950s. And that's the way that I see it going. I don't think there's going to be any sort of peace settlement. I don't think there's going to be a treaty. I don't think there's going to be any sort of like UN referendum anywhere. While these are good ideas, I don't think that Russia and Ukraine are so far apart in what their goals are on this. And neither side seems to be capable right now of delivering a knockout blow. That what I think is going to happen is that the trench warfare is just going to continue on. And Ukraine will keep fighting. Russia will keep fighting until one or the other gives out, either through lack of international support or their economy crumbles. Or what you might see is something similar to the Korean Peninsula, or something similar to Cyprus, for example, between the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus and the rest of the Greek-speaking part of the country, or something similar to what happened in Georgia between Georgia and South Ossetia, or Georgia and Abkhazia. Like there's so many examples of this. You could point to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which we're going to get to next. Like that's the direction that I think this is going. Is I think it's going to turn into a frozen conflict where it's not actually going to be over, and there's always going to be a danger that it will flare up again. In fact, I think it'll be inevitable. I
think that's totally plausible. The only reason why I don't think it's going to end that way is because Ukraine does not have the capacity to take back the territory without massive Western involvement of infusion of material and resources. And so I think the West knows there needs to be a negotiated settlement, because if they pull out, it's going to be harder for them to get back into this. And Russia over time, because Russia right now is working closer and closer with China, working closer and closer, and not making itself dependent upon Western banking systems and everything else. In the end, I think this ends with a settlement that doesn't leave Ukraine very well off. I think it leaves the West in a worse situation. And I think hindsight, people are going to look back and say, this probably all could have been avoided with two things. Assurances that the Ukraine was not going to enter into NATO, which I think was a perfectly reasonable concession. And a U.S. administration that Putin actually worried about. I think Putin understandably had no fear of the Biden administration. So anyways, that's our predictions for Ukraine. Let's move on to
the most peaceful part of the world.
Yeah, Israel and Gaza. So again, we've done a couple of episodes on this, so we're not going to do a complete once over the world again, but obviously, when you say, how did this start? Well,
pretty obvious how this one started.
Well, and this is the part where people
a lot of people will say, well, this started actually, the Giga Chad super base take is, this actually started with the Assyrians.
Yeah. This is the part where, again, we've made the argument on here, and actually I think we released a Y-Minute that made it again, where I'm going to say right now, I don't buy into this whole argument that Israel is a colonizing state in the Levant. Israel has Jews have a 3,000-year history in this part of the world, and a continuous population in this part of the world for 3,000 years. In fact, Palestine has never been an independent nation in the Levant. Israel was, right? Israel was. Judah was. And so I understand that was a long time ago. And like we've said before, if the Arabs living in the Levant want to make the argument that there should have been a two-state system, well, that's an agreement that Israel agreed to. They agreed to it in 1947 and 48. They agreed to it again in 2000 with the Camp David Accords with Iyad Barak and Yasser Arafat. It has always been the Arabs in the region that have never agreed to a two-party state. And not a two-party state, but a two-state solution. And again, what I find a little bit disingenuous about all of this is this idea that, when we talk about occupied territories, well, first of all, Israel doesn't occupy the Gaza Strip. Yes, Israel still occupies the West Bank, but you could also make the argument that, well, the West Bank was lost in war. And it turns out most of the countries that exist today took a little bit of their land through warfare.
Oh, my favorite decolonization take is that decolonization doesn't become a thing until after the Islamic conquest.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and we pointed this out. Almost every single Arab country, predominantly Arab country that exists, with the exception of like maybe Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, Yemen, Qatar. That was all the original like Arabian like homeland areas. It wasn't Egypt. It wasn't Iraq.
I was going to say, take a guess who was living in Egypt
Syria,
1,300 years
Lebanon,
ago.
right?
Yeah.
So it's like, can we at least display a little intellectual consistency and honesty here, right? I am sympathetic to the argument for why Arabs would want their own state in the Levant. The problem is that they don't seem to be willing to accept any sort of two-state solution that has been offered either by the United Nations or through negotiated peace agreements, because they don't accept the existence of Israel. So if you're Israel at this point and you've had to fight multiple wars in your relatively short, modern history, you're probably not all that conducive to a two-state system where the people keep rocketing you. So I'm sorry. Like I can sympathize for the people that are in difficult situations on both sides of this, and I always sympathize with innocent people that die as a result of combat. What I don't accept and will never accept is the moral equivalency between those who deliberately target innocent civilians in order to achieve their military and political objectives and those who do not. Right? If I tell you evacuate these, but first of all, you're under no obligation to tell your enemy you're going to attack legitimate military targets. Right, Hamas has chosen to put a lot of their military infrastructure and what would be considered legitimate military targets in any sort of war scenario. They've chosen to put them in areas with high density civilians that have nothing to do with their military operations or political operations. Right, they have chosen to do this, and part of the reason why they have chosen to do this is because Hamas has a worldview which informs them that they are engaging in a holy war against Israel. And if women and children have to die as a result of that, well, then that is a necessary expenditure. All right. So one of the reasons why I get so frustrated with people that will look at Israel striking into Gaza and say, don't you have any concern for civilians dying in Gaza? Yes, I do. The problem is that Hamas doesn't make any effort to say, let's get our civilian population out of harm's way. Hamas blares out from madrasas and mosques all over Gaza, telling people to stay put. And the reason why they do that is because morons in the West will look at civilian casualties in Gaza that Hamas is either directly responsible for or indirectly responsible for because they deliberately put them in harm's way and say, oh, see, this is just as bad as what Hamas did in Israel. No, it isn't. It is equally tragic for the person that is hurt as a result of it, but it is not morally equivalent.
No, it's not.
And in fact, if you can't wrap your mind around that, then here's what you're doing. Right? And I'm not saying you're doing this directly. I'm saying this is the incentive structure you're contributing to. The reason why we have things like the Geneva Convention, the reason why we have things with respect to things like rules of war, and if you conduct yourself in this way, there are certain legal protections. If you leave those legal protections, if you leave those standards of conduct, and you start to do something else because you think it's going to give you a military advantage, you no longer receive the benefit of those legal protection. Okay. If somebody can conduct terrorist activities and be treated just like a regular uniformed soldier, you're actually incentivizing them to do that, especially when you reward them for it by saying, oh, Israel, you need to pull back now from your military offensive because civilians got killed. What you just told Hamas was, if you kill your own civilians, right, in this war that you believe is justified because God wills it, if you kill your own civilians, you can actually stop the Israeli military from actually conducting offensive operations because the rest of the world will come in and tell them to. You've just made it a tactic. You've made it a beneficial tactic for Hamas. So no, what the pressure should be on Hamas right now is you need to stop telling civilians to stay in place when Israel has already announced that they're going to conduct military operations in that area. You need to stop using civilians as human shields for your military targets. You need to protect your own people by removing them from areas that are about to undergo shelling.
There is no moral equivalency whatsoever between what Hamas did and what Israel is currently doing in response. None whatsoever. And by the way, I say this as somebody who has publicly come out for several years now and said, I don't think we should be giving Israel foreign aid, which is a very controversial take for somebody on the right, because Republicans love to give foreign aid to Israel. I've criticized Israel's foreign policy for years. I will continue to do so where I find it legitimate. But the idea that you're seeing this within Western academia, right? You're seeing this within certain elements of the left. The idea that Israel is some sort of like terrorist state of its own and that they're on the same footing as Hamas is complete intellectual bankruptcy. Complete intellectual bankruptcy. Yeah. The idea that the IDF is engaging in the same sort of activities that Hamas is, you're either lying or you're stupid if you're going to make that argument.
Well, Angel D asked the question, what do you think of the claims that Israel has been engaging in genocide for the past few decades and Western media not covering this alleged genocide? Here's my problem with that.
They are, but not in the place where people think.
I don't even know what you mean by that.
I'm referring to Israel's extensive military alliance with Azerbaijan.
Okay. All right. We can
talk about that later.
I know you desperately want to talk about this. Let's talk about it later. Israel, because I have real problems with what Israel's doing over there as well. I don't think, no, let me word this carefully. Could you make an argument that Israel or the Israeli military, or early on in Israel's history with organizations like the Irgun Group, that they committed atrocities against Arabs in the Levant or against Palestine? People describe themselves as Palestinians. Yeah, you could. And I think that's reprehensible. And I think that largely you've seen within Israel an attempt to actually ensure that doesn't happen within their forces, right? You can always point to one-off situations. I don't see evidence. I don't see evidence that the IDF has engaged in any sort of, think about that, genocide. Genocide is you are deliberately killing a population based off of their ethnicity with the purpose of wiping them off the face of the planet. So no, I don't see evidence for that. And this idea that the Western media has been hiding it, first of all, let's say that maybe 20 years ago, the Western media, had it even been inclined, could have done something like that. They would not have been able to do that for the last 20 years. There's no way. Everybody has got a camera on their phone. You've got Al Jazeera as one of the large. You think Al Jazeera is covering up Israeli atrocities? I don't see it. In fact, what I do see is that every single time a civilian gets hurt in Gaza or the West Bank, a Palestinian gets hurt in the Gaza or the West Bank, Western media runs with it. The United Nations condemns Israel more than any other country in the world, not because Israel has the worst war crimes record or the worst civil rights record. It's because a bunch of Muslim nations consistently vote against Israel. So, I'm sorry, I don't see the evidence for it. I don't believe it's there. I believe that there's been some massive conspiracy that you could get the Western media to all get online with and say, no, we're going to protect whatever the Israeli government does. I'm sorry. And Angel, I understand you're just asking a question because this is something that gets brought up a lot. So I'm wanting to say when I do this mocking tone, it's not directed toward you. But I think it's absurd. I don't think there's any possible way Israel could have gotten away with a genocide. And the other argument is, well, they have an apartheid state. Really? Because there's a lot of Arabs and a lot of Muslims living within Israel.
That have Israeli citizenship.
That has Israeli citizenship. And you know what happens when they have Israeli citizenship? They can vote. They can hold political parties. They serve in the military. They serve in the judiciary. Right?
They serve in the Israeli parliament.
The reason why there's a difference between, again, people who are saying that they are Palestinians is because they're not Israeli citizens. And then when it comes to a place like Gaza, where it's like, okay, well, but Israel cut off the water and electricity. Okay, here's my question. Why is Israel? Billions of dollars flow into Gaza in humanitarian aid from countries all over the world. And I believe the EU is the single largest provider of foreign aid to Gaza. Here's my question. Why are they completely dependent upon Israel for electricity and water?
I've got a better question. Why is Israel obligated to provide water and electricity to a state governed by a terrorist organization that just committed mass genocide against their people?
And has it in their charter
to kill all Jews?
To kill Jews.
There again, there's no. I do think there's room for legitimate criticisms of things that Israel does, but there is absolutely. I've said this before. I will continue to say it. There is absolutely no legitimate criticism that you could make when it comes to try to argue that Israel and Hamas are moral equivalents whatsoever. There is what. Say whatever you want about Israeli foreign policy. Say whatever you want about Israeli domestic policy. It doesn't matter. In this conflict right now that's going on, there is one side that is objectively evil, and there's another side that was just brutally victimized.
So here's what I'll say.
And it's not the side that Western academics and students right now all over the world are going out there and saying this is a genocidal apartheid state. No, Israel is the victim right now, and Hamas are the perpetrators. The same group that people in universities all over the country are now praising for decolonizing a piece of land that belonged to the Jews for over 3,000 years. But I also find it really funny that leftists in academia want to use blood and soil arguments when it suits them, and then will simultaneously come out there and say things like no immigrant is illegal. It's just it really goes to show you that there is no intellectual consistency whatsoever on the left whatsoever. They will pull whatever argument they can out of the ether in order to further their ideological ends. And I've said before, their ideological ends are the accumulation of power, and whatever argument gets them to that point, they'll adopt it and then discard it the second it doesn't suit their ends.
So real quick, obviously this has been all over the news, so people kind of know what happens. Hamas launched an attack. A lot of people are curious how Mossad could not have seen this coming. That is a legitimate question because Mossad has a reputation for being pretty good. Now, again, we articulated before, these things happen, right? Like I don't think Mossad, intentionally stood down on the Yom Kippur War in 1973 when Egypt and Syria just surprised him. It just is what it is sometimes. But you also notice, and actually there's a really good video by, I think it was Task and Purpose on YouTube. He did a good video talking about how Israel could have been potentially caught off guard on this one. But as you look what happened, Hamas, their military forces went into Israel. They launched somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 rockets at the same time that they took out a lot of the technical sensors along the border. And then they used bulldozers, among other things, in order to open up holes in the wall to where Hamas fighters came into Israel. They attacked several kibbutz. When they went into these kibbutz, they murdered women and children. They took several other people hostage. I think it was up to like 100 to 150 hostages back into Gaza to be used as human shields. Israel responded, took back the kibbutz, pushed Hamas back into Gaza, and then they started launching airstrikes, artillery bombardments, among other things within portions within there. They gave notification for civilians to leave the area. At the same time, Hamas told civilians to stay put. This is another thing I want to mention, too, that I think is totally disingenuous. The United Nations, when Israel said, hey, you have 24 hours to evacuate, the UN came in and said, well, that's impossible. They're not going to be able to do that. You want to know part of the reason? Just so you know, Gaza is roughly the size of what? Like New York, like city?
It's about twice the size of Washington, D.C.
Okay, so twice the size of Washington, D.C. So not a tiny area, but not huge. Okay. Do you see at the bottom there? Because the other thing you keep hearing say is, well, Israel has blockaded the border. Yes, Israel has blockaded the border with Israel. That's typically what you do when you're being invaded, right? There's nothing wrong with this. Oh, they've cut off water and electricity. Yep, once again, not obligated to provide water and electricity to a government that is trying to kill them and murdering their civilians. But do you see the border there on the south? Hey, what's that border? Oh, that's Egypt. Yeah, the southern border of Gaza is with Egypt.
Which last I checked isn't Israel.
Not Israel. Turns out not Israel. Here's my question. Has Egypt opened up the borders to allow for hundreds of thousands of people to cross the border into safe areas? Have they opened it up to be able to launch like massive amounts of humanitarian aid into Gaza? Nope.
You know what they're doing instead right now? They're building a massive border wall.
Yeah, they're actually increasing the border wall they already have with Gaza. Right?
That should tell you something.
So for the UN to be like, well, this is just totally unreasonable for Israel to say that. No, it is not unreasonable for you to leave within 24 hours. You're not going to be able to pack up all your furniture and sell your house. That's definitely true. Right. But the idea that you cannot leave this area within a 24-hour time period, an area the size that's a little bit bigger, that's twice the size of Washington, D.C., that you can't leave that in a day. And again, keep something in mind. You don't have to leave the entire Gaza Strip. Most of the military activity is taken in Gaza City, right? You can flee to the southern portion. So there are ways that you can evacuate. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's ideal. I'm not saying I don't have sympathy for the innocent people caught up in this. Okay, but for the UN to say, well, this is impossible, and so therefore it's not reasonable. Okay, UN, who once again puts countries like Sudan and Iran on the Human Rights Commission. I'm sorry, I just don't trust your judgment anymore. So they pushed it back. Israel has already promised they are going in and they're going to destroy Hamas.
So this gets us to where we think things are going, because Israel has not.
Real quick, somebody asked, what's a kibbutz? A kibbutz is a little bit like a communal farm concept. And kibbutz are responsible for a lot of the agricultural output within Israel. So I don't want to say that they're all like communes in the traditional like collectivist idea. Some are a little bit more collectivist than others, but that's what it's a small farming community is a kibbutz. Go ahead.
So Israel has yet to cross into Gaza with a significant amount of forces. I think that they've only sent like some like probing movements, but they haven't like actually invaded the Gaza Strip, certainly in force. And I mean, as we're speaking right now, there's probably only a handful of Israeli soldiers that are actually across the 1950 armistice line right now. And it's kind of interesting that Israel hasn't gone in yet. They continue to strike, targets using artillery and airstrikes, but they haven't actually deployed the 100. I mean, they have like 400,000 troops basically surrounding Gaza at the moment. And
well, can I?
I mean, that's kind of overkill, to be honest.
Well, here's what we're looking at. Like one of the questions that continually has been asked about this is, why would Hamas do this? And we should always leave room open for look, let me put it this way. It is a mistake to suggest that, oh, well, they're all just crazy, or they just made a completely irrational decision. If you do analysis that way, you usually find out that no, they had a rationale. It might not have been a good one. They might have been leaving things out of their analysis that would have helped them to make a better decision. But usually when people make a decision, it makes sense to them at the time based off of their objectives and available information. I think the primary reason why Hamas did this was I think they were under a pressure from Iran, because Iran is a large supplier to Hamas. And I think Hamas and Iran both, and you could say this about a lot of these different organizations, because it's not just Hamas, it's also Hezbollah and Quds Force and other terrorist groups. Relations between Israel and Middle Eastern countries and Arab countries have been gradually improving over the last decade, like in significant steps. It started off early on in the 70s and with countries like Egypt and Jordan. But now we're talking about countries like Saudi Arabia potentially normalizing relations with Israel. And that presents a huge problem to Iran, who wants to essentially be the dominant force within the Muslim world. And it also presents a huge problem to all of these terrorist organizations who essentially rely upon their current status to justify increased funding for their governments, funding for their military operations. Not to mention the fact that Yasser Arafat, who used to be the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, let's just say he owned a lot of villas and mansions for the war leader of a refugee population.
The Palestinians have the same problem that a lot of African countries have, where they elect these elitist political demagogues who then enrich themselves and don't actually do anything to benefit the people that elect them. It's falling for the political strongman, right?
Yeah.
And you also see this in a lot of major American cities, right? Like Chicago, New York City, Detroit, like continuously electing Democrat political elitists to office, and then things don't get any better. In fact, in many cases, things continue to get worse. The Palestinians have been dealing with that problem for a long time. But one thing that I find really fascinating here is that Israel recently, this was actually under Trump, you brought up that like Israel normalized relations with the UAE and Bahrain in like the last year of Trump's presidency. And they were on the verge of normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, which would have opened the floodgates for the rest of the Middle East to finally normalize relations with Israel. This whole conflict that's now going on has put all of that in doubt.
Yeah.
At the same time that earlier this year, I think it was back in March, Saudi Arabia and Iran normalized relations. I actually wrote about this on Twitter recently. I said that the Iranian foreign policy for the last 1,300 years could be categorized as attempting to overturn the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. Al-Qadisiyah was the famous Islamic defeat of the Sassanids in the Mesopotamia region at the very beginning of the Islamic conquests, because Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, basically was part of Iran for like 1,000 years, right? And ever since the Islamic conquests, the Persian heartland has been restricted to the Persian heartland. The various kingdoms and dynasties that have ruled Iran have been restricted basically to the Iranian plateau rather than the historical borders of Greater Persia. And so you could argue, I think convincingly so, that Iranian foreign policy for, again, over a millennia has basically been an attempt to overturn that status quo. And in doing so, that has led them into conflict with first Turkey. There were repeated wars between the Safavids and the Ottomans, for example, over control of, again, modern-day Iraq in the 17 and 1800s. And then eventually it led to conflict with Saudi Arabia, because it was from the Arabian Peninsula that the Islamic conquests of Persia took place. And so those two geographic regions have always, I mean, going back to Crassus, basically, have been at odds with whatever power controls the Iranian plateau. If you see a situation where Iran normalizes relations with Saudi Arabia, that is like a tectonic shift in the region's geopolitics that you have literally not seen for centuries, if not over 1,000 years. Those two regions, whatever, again, countries change and go, right? But whoever occupies the Iranian plateau and whoever occupies the Arabian Peninsula, those two regions have almost never gotten along with each other. And if you see a normalization of relations, that really changes things.
Well, and I think that at this point, when I look at the motivation for this, because again, Hamas is going to get crushed. The question will be is, does this bleed into a larger regional conflict? Does something happen? Like, so far, I'm actually kind of surprised, because some of the remarks coming out of Saudi Arabia and other countries have been, definitively on the side of the Palestinians, but somewhat muted compared to what you might expect to see. And so I almost wonder if this is a situation where, when we get into, okay, so what's going to happen with this? The prediction I gave earlier was, I think Israel's going to go on there. I think they're going to make Hamas an untenable party within the Palestinian areas of Gaza and the West Bank. But I think overall, I think Iran might have overplayed their hands on this one. This is also an area where the Biden administration, regardless of how you feel about what they did, the Biden administration actually acted fairly decisively this time. They deployed one carrier battle group. There was another one that was already going off. So you got the Gerald Ford carrier battle group going over there. There's going to be like at least 90 combat aircraft that are actually standing by. And what that does is, there's some people looking at it going, well, this is just prelude to World War III. Obviously, if someone struck a U.S. aircraft carrier, that could potentially cause a wider problem. And that's the biggest concern that's going on right now. And it's a legitimate concern. If all of a sudden you get somebody that fires a missile, hits a U.S. aircraft carrier, and 100 U.S. military personnel are killed as a result, that could spark a much wider conflict. By the same token, there is something of the goal is the carrier battle group provides a stabilizing influence in the area, to where Arab countries that might be considering whether or not they should get involved in this in a bigger way now have something of excuse to not do it. And you could say, well, what do you mean? Like, terrorist groups, that they want to be able to show the United States getting involved in that area because they think it galvanizes their own forces. Okay, maybe so, but the Egyptian military doesn't feel that way. The Saudi Arabians don't feel that way. The Saudi Arabian government, anyway, doesn't feel that way. And the Syrian government is not in a position to be able to get involved in another armed conflict right now, especially one where they know they would lose. There's plenty of historical evidence to demonstrate that Syria would get beaten very, very badly if they tried to get engaged in this. And Jordan certainly doesn't want to get drawn in anything major as well. So what's going to be really interesting to see is what Israel potentially prioritizes with respect to their own security strategy. I think they are mad enough to where like this is it. They're going after Hamas. And again, I think people need to put it in a proper perspective. This would be the equivalent of the United States. When you look at population differentials, this would be the equivalent of the United States losing over 20,000 people in a single day to terrorist attacks. Like, what would the response be from the American population, the military, if we lost 20,000 people in a single day to a terrorist attacks, and then the same people that perpetrated those attacks then carried over thousands of our citizens to be used as human shields into a foreign country? Like, if Mexico did this to us, we would be out for blood. And so it's not unreasonable to understand that the very justifiable and I don't say emotional as like in a way to suggest that there isn't a logic behind it, but it is both an emotional and a logical move by Israel at this point to say we have to demonstrate that we will crush anybody that does this. And so I do think Israel is going to make good on insisting on the destruction of Hamas. I think Egypt is going to largely stay out of it. I think Saudi Arabia might get more strong notes of protest. But again, I'm going to stick with what I said before. I think as long as Israel can avoid escalating it to a degree where those other countries feel obligated to get in militarily, and I think the U.S. presence is meant to try to stop that as well, I think Iran finds itself in a position where they couldn't take on Israel by themselves. They certainly can't take on the United States. And so I think Iran might have overplayed their hand on this one, because I think the Arab countries that they meant to influence by this action kind of see through the strategy. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is the United States gets drawn into war because our troops within such close proximity get attacked. But here's what I will tell you. That's the worst proximity for the United States, because obviously I don't want us involved in another war. But it's also probably the worst possible outcome for Iran as well, because I could honestly see a scenario where, regardless of who attack, it's not going to be Egypt that attacks us. It's not going to be Saudi Arabia. It would be Iran, or it would be a terrorist organization operating with Iranian equipment. And so, however you slice this, it might be bad for the United States if we get attacked, but it's horrible for Iran, because then what it's going to do is it's going to provide it's going to put the United States, it's going to give us casus belli to attack Iran, who is once again seen as a much greater threat to countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain. So I don't know. I think they might have overplayed their hand.
I mean, we're still really early into this, right? The jury's still out to what degree Hezbollah will get involved in Lebanon. Israel has targeted airports in Syria, have attacked them with their own aircraft. So, I mean, I doubt that Syria will do much in response, though, because they still have a civil war of their own that they're mopping up. I don't know. We don't know how much this is going to escalate. I do think that there is a lot of hyperbolic language from people out there that think this is going to turn into a world war, which is very funny because we actually use that as a thumbnail in one of our videos. But we just don't know. We don't know yet. We also don't know when Israel will go into Gaza. There hasn't been a timetable set for that. Again, they have 300,000 or 400,000 troops on the border, but other than bombing, they haven't actually marched in.
So that's a good point. Let's also talk about this, because we mentioned this before with Ukraine and Russia. Logistics.
Yep.
The reason why Israel doesn't have a standing army of 400,000 troops. Israel's standing army is actually much smaller, and for understandable reasons. They have a population of, I think, just under 10 million. And so when you look at they have conscription, military age is 17. Conscription is 24 to 34 months long. But when you talk about I'm trying to find up the.
I mean, Israel has mobilized over.
Their active personnel is 169,500 troops within their military. Their reserve personnel is 465,000. But you got to understand, when you are mobilizing that percentage of your population, because I mean,
Israel has mobilized over 5% of their pop. I mean, that's massive. Insane. That's
massive.
A lot.
That is a huge hit to their own economy. This is one of the reasons why Israel launched the war it did in 1967, is because they can't fight a long war of attrition. They have to destroy their enemies' offensive capabilities, and then they got to get their people back to work. And so they typically fight shorter, very, well coordinated combined arms efforts to destroy offensive capability. They don't try to go in and maintain territory outside of what you might consider kind of traditional borders of the Levant. So I think part of the reason why they're waiting on Gaza and whatnot is that's going to be difficult, man. When you've got over 1 million people in a relatively small area, which is predominantly urban, that is a dangerous place to conduct military operations.
I mean, they're going to have to clear Gaza City building by building.
Yeah.
That's not fun.
Not to mention that Hamas doesn't mind using human shields. They don't mind putting civilians in harm's way.
They don't mind using booby traps.
And this is the other thing that I will say this: the longer we get from when the attacks took place, and where for the Israeli population no longer feels that immediate fear, when Israel gets its people back, I think there's going to be kind of this breathing moment where everyone's going to take a deep breath, and I think Israel's still going to be deliberately targeting Hamas, but I don't think Israel is going to try to go in and completely occupy and hold Gaza. Now, I could be wrong on that. Out of everything I've said today, the thing that I have the least amount of confidence in is what I just said. I just think the troops required to do something like that is very, very damaging to the Israeli economy. It's gonna lead to a lot more casualties. It also creates a scenario where there's going to be a lot more civilian casualties within Gaza. And even though I can look at that and say Hamas is largely to blame for that, the more the civilian casualty totals increase, the more Israel will be inevitably blamed for it, because now they will be seen to be on the offensive. And again, I think there's a whole lot of logical inconsistency with somebody making that argument. But I also recognize what happens when you have increased civilian casualties.
All right. So do we want to move on to the next conflict? We're about an hour and a half in.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next one that we're going to talk about. And this is the theoretical conflict.
This is a frozen conflict, though.
It is. It's a frozen conflict. So technically, China considers Taiwan to be part of the People's Republic of China, and the Republic of China considers the People's Republic of China to be a part of both sides.
Taiwan has not changed from their perspective. They have not changed their status quo because they know if they do so, China has vowed to invade them. Yeah. So believe it or not, the PRC and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, wants Taiwan to continue to call itself the Republic of China and lay claim to mainland China, because the second that they don't do that is basically them saying we're a separate independent country that lays no claim to the mainland. And at that point, they're basically declaring themselves to sever all ties to the mainland, and the Communist Party of China has vowed to invade Taiwan if that happens. So as weird as it sounds, mainland China wants Taiwan to keep calling itself the Republic of China and lay claim to the mainland. And they also, I'm going to say something that anybody who's actually like a real expert on Taiwanese geopolitics might get upset because I'm really oversimplifying things. But like, in a way, the CCP also really supports the KMT, which is really ironic if you know anything about Chinese history. And the reason why is not because the KMT is pro-communist. They're obviously not pro-communist. They're very conservative. But the KMT is pro-Chinese nationalist.
Yes.
I mean, they literally are the Chinese Nationalist Party. And the KMT is the party in Taiwan that wants to keep the whole concept of we are the Republic of China, and believe it or not, also wants closer relations to the mainland. When the KMT ruled Taiwan, historically the KMT ruled Taiwan obviously for decades, but after the transition to democracy, the KMT still held power for several election cycles until about 10 years ago. Up until about 10 years ago, even the democratically elected KMT actually sought closer relations with the mainland. There was a hope at one point in time that a one country, two systems situation could actually be worked out. Yeah. That is gone now. Yeah. After what happened to Hong Kong, it is clear anybody who saw what happened to Hong Kong realizes that one country, two systems will eventually turn into one country, one system. Yeah. And it ain't going to be a free market, liberal democracy.
Well, and that's so. This
Xi Jinping, in many respects, has nobody to blame but himself for the reason why the whole Taiwan situation cannot be resolved peacefully.
Yeah.
And it's either going to result in either war or a continuation of the status quo, because China telegraphed to the world what they will do to Taiwan after they did it to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Anybody with a brain now in Taiwan realizes if we ever agree to put ourselves under the control of mainland China, we will turn into the next Hong Kong.
Well,
and they don't want that.
And here's the area. Whenever we talk about potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the argument always goes to, oh, well, the United States military wouldn't let that happen. And I actually tend to agree with that. It's not as if there is a direct treaty necessarily guaranteeing Taiwan's defense, but it has been a tradition, let's just say, I think since the 1970s, that the United States kind of quasi-guarantees Taiwan's independence. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you. We're looking at a map right now. For those of you who are following along on audio, the main point I want to make about this, because there's been so much speculation on, oh, well, the United States is sending all this money and equipment to Ukraine, and now it's getting involved in Israel and the Middle East again. This is going to create a scenario where China is going to potentially feel like it's time to settle some scores and potentially engage in territorial expansion and maybe take back Taiwan. Here's why I don't think that's going to happen.
You don't think they're going to try to invade?
I don't think they're going to try to invade.
Because a lot of people think that they're
I know
going to.
And I think that what a lot of people see is they see the numbers. This is, again, I go back to my old thing, the bean counting approach to military operations. People are looking at numbers on an Excel spreadsheet. They're not looking at the actual logistical nightmare that is conducting an amphibious and airborne operation of Taiwan. The largest, amphibious operation in world history was D-Day. That took place across the English Channel, roughly 22 miles, I think, give or take. It happened with overwhelming air superiority. It happened with overwhelming naval superiority. And the Germans at Normandy actually they did not have their best troops there by any stretch of the imagination. And they didn't actually deploy their armored reserves under Rommel in a timely manner. Because at that point, Hitler was convinced that the real invasion was coming at Calais, not at Normandy. So the important thing to understand is that was the largest and arguably most successful amphibious operation of all time. Over 22 miles, complete air and naval superiority, and overwhelming force. If China were to attempt to invade Taiwan, they would have to go over about 100 miles over open ocean. They would have to be able to maintain air and naval superiority in order to make sure that things like troop transports didn't get sunk on the way there. They would have various options with respect to potential landing sites, but when you're having to go in the age of satellites and in the age of high-tech sensory, this ain't World War II where the Nazi, when you left the harbor in England and you had 22 miles to go, you could get there relatively quickly. Taiwan's going to know exactly where the Chinese fleet is headed and where their troop transports are headed. They're going to have plenty of lead time. They're going to have plenty of time to be ready for this, in part because China would most likely try to do what they call a decapitation strike. And a decapitation strike is when you go after your senior political and military leadership. You might actually go after your industrial leadership as well in order to upset the economy. But think of it as a first strike against, the capital, the government, the military, all the strategic plays in an attempt to take them out of commission and create confusion to give you enough time to be able to secure a beachhead, right? That's critical. The problem is to do that in the modern era is incredibly difficult with satellite and sensor technology. The other problem that they're going to have is you can look at China's 2 million man army all day long, and then you can look at Taiwan's. Taiwan has an active duty force of 215,000 personnel, and you can say, oh my gosh, 2 million to 215,000. That's, how do they even send it? Because the 2 million people are not on troop transports heading over to Taiwan, right? You're going to have an initial invasion force. So you'd probably have a combination of airborne and seaborne invasion. But it's not like China gets to ship its entire military to Taiwan. They have hostile relationships and ongoing border disputes with India. India has a massive military, is also a nuclear power, and has also just surpassed China in population. You have other militaries on the border of China that are not necessarily friendly toward China. Not to say that they would do anything, but it's just to say that China can't just up and just, get rid of everybody. So arguably you're going to have a few 100,000 troops that you try to move over there that's going to run into a 215,000 man active duty force. And then on top of that, because they have to go over 100 miles and because Taiwan has been preparing for something like this, Taiwan has 2.3 million reserve personnel. Now, you look at the terrain in Taiwan, and the thing that it doesn't have going for it is the flatland is all facing east, right? That creates a difficulty for Taiwan because that's where China would land.
No. The flatland is.
Facing west. So it's facing toward mainland China.
Yes.
That's a strategic problem. But then you look at the whole rest of the country. It is mountainous terrain. It is an absolute nightmare to be able to fight through. And if there's any question on whether or not the Taiwanese or the Republic of China has the will to fight, I think they absolutely do. And I think as you look at what Christian was just saying about Hong Kong, I think they've seen what the PRC will do to a country that was supposed to have one party, two states, and I think they fight. Now, notice what I haven't said so far. In none of this have I mentioned U.S. involvement, other than initially saying that U.S. has kind of had this, agreement to protect Taiwan's security. But everything I just described from the military perspective is everything China would have to do to have a chance to beat Taiwan without any outside interference whatsoever. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that even if the United States didn't get involved, this would be an absolute logistical nightmare for the Chinese to pull off. Because Taiwan does have a professional military. It does have advanced equipment. It has geared its entire military's existence toward repelling an invasion from China. The Taiwanese military does not train so that they can one day invade the Philippines, right? The Taiwanese military exists to protect its island from the PRC. And so their military drills, their training, the equipment that they purchase, everything they do is geared around that. So there's no hiding the ball here. Even if China managed to get some degree of surprise from this, all of their military's training has been built toward this purpose. So they have contingency plan after contingency plan after contingency plan. And then it's not like Taiwan has to achieve air superiority. They just have to be able to compete. Because a couple of missiles, a couple of drone attacks that sinks a troop transport, and all of a sudden China loses 5,000 troops in the Taiwan Strait, right? Those numbers add up pretty quick. And when it comes to deploying large numbers of personnel, you're not going to do that with airborne forces. So I go back to the amount of devastation China would have to wreak on Taiwan in order to soften it up for a seaborne invasion is massive. I don't know how effectively they'd be able to do a decapitation strike. And I think even if they did, the Taiwanese military and government is set up with appropriate contingency plans to be able to fight on after the fact. I also think that if China did do something so devastating to the civilian population, which they would almost have to, I think there would be enough international outrage to where you would have actually people supplying Taiwan. And China does not have the ability to secure the island off from the rest of the world. China will not be able to prevent reinforcements coming into Taiwan. And here's the other thing that I will say. If the United States military did decide to get involved militarily, they could help push back China without landing a single boot on the ground in Taiwan, other than maybe pilots for air personnel. What I'm talking about is we would not have to deploy the 82nd Airborne Division, the 25th Infantry over in Hawaii. We would not have to deploy troops out of Korea. We would not have to put significant ground forces on the ground in Taiwan to help the Taiwanese repel a Chinese invasion. All we would have to do is pose a significant enough threat to China's air superiority and naval superiority in that region, and that would be it. They would be done, because logistically, there is no way that they would be able to sustain a force in Taiwan against determined organized resistance if they can't maintain supply lines. That's my position.
So someone in the chat very early in the episode asked me a question on what my take is, I think Peter Zeihan might have talked about this, that he thinks that, I believe, and I might be wrong on this because I don't watch all of his videos, but he thinks that China has a strong incentive to invade sooner than later because of the demographic situation within China. So China's population is shrinking, as insane as that sounds.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened since the Great Leap Forward.
To give everyone an idea here, some context here, China is set to lose 750 million people by the end of the century.
They're set to lose almost half of their country's population.
Yeah. Now, again,
in like 80 years
things
or so.
could change, but we're just saying current trajectories, that's where this is headed.
I mean, that is devastating to a country's ability to project power, right? Like, yeah. I mean, we talk about ghost cities in China. Like, imagine when they lose 700 million people. That's like twice the population of the United States that they're going to shrink by.
Yeah.
And so China is arguably at its peak right now in terms of its ability to throw men at a problem in order to try to solve it, right? Which is historically how China has fought wars, right? You go into Chinese history and it's like, the Wu-Tang Rebellion. I'm joking, right? Yeah. But like, the Wu-Tang Rebellion. This obscure rebellion in the 1600s led to, 30 million deaths. Yeah. Like, and that's just like a typical Chinese civil war, right? And the problem that China's political leaders have right now is, in many respects, I would argue, a problem of their own making, because again, the Hong Kong situation has basically torpedoed the idea of a peaceful reunification with the mainland. But the problem that they have right now is they have got to make a political calculation of, is it worth the risk right now? Because 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40, 50 years from now, we might physically be like, whatever argument you want to make, I do think that China is physically capable of attempting to attack Taiwan.
Sure.
But you could make the argument likewise that in 3 generations or 2 generations from now, they might not be physically capable of doing so.
No, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I will say that I do believe that I think China is set to probably have massive civil unrest in a relatively short period of time. And a lot of times when a dictatorial leader is faced with domestic civil unrest, they start looking for foreign excursions to try to distract.
It's the Falklands situation, right? Yeah. I mean, Argentina's military, quasi-Peronist dictatorship in the 80s had, shocker, just like always, massive inflation and high unemployment. And the response was, let's start a war with Great Britain over the Falklands, which went about as well as you could expect. You might have a Falklands enlarged, by 1,000-fold, right?
Yeah.
Going on with, in every single respect.
Look, if Taiwan was connected to the mainland, I would be a lot more concerned.
Oh, it'd be over. It would have been a Tibet situation.
But here's the other thing. So we got some questions here. 11 Bravo Crunchies. Dude, I love that name, man. 11 Bravo Crunchy. Thank you for the super chat. On top of all that, China has only 2-month-long window of favorable tide and weather in the Taiwan Strait. That's an excellent point. Weather is probably one of the things that gets the least amount of attention when you look at kind of some of the like Fox News or CNN hits on these things, and understandably, why people are focused usually on men and material and everything else. But yeah, the weather is a huge factor in all of this, and it's never going to cease to be. And there's a reason why, again, good military strategists who are also thinking about logistics, we in the military we called it MET-T. You had was it mission, enemy, train time, troops, and then they added a bunch of other criteria of civilians on the battlefield and stuff like that, communications. But if you look at terrain and weather, these are huge considerations when it comes to conducting military operations, and especially when you have something this complex, 100 miles open sea, tides affect that, right? Like you may have a really, really cool cruiser, you may have really, really cool troop transports, but and they may be able to mitigate some of those weather considerations, but they don't eliminate them. And then again, it narrows the window for when it's acceptable to conduct these military operations, which conveys an advantage to the defense. I think we got some more. Do we have some more questions?
We have a lot of questions prepared.
There was a question that I just saw that I was trying to answer in the chat, but I want to bring it up for the audio listeners because I think it's quite valuable. Somebody asked about the potential threat. What's to stop China from using nuclear weapons on Taiwan.
Yeah.
So there's a mutually assured destruction component of this. Twofold. First off, Taiwan likely has the means to develop nuclear weapons of their own in a relatively short amount of time. They have no shortage of geniuses over in Taiwan.
Yeah.
For example, they construct a majority of the world's semiconductors.
And that actually got asked as a question too. So.
But there's another component that Taiwan has up its sleeve, basically a whole, mutually assured destruction type of card. Taiwan has the ability, it'd be really difficult to pull it off, but it's conceivable. Taiwan has the ability to hit the Three Gorges Dam.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeez.
I mean, and that would result in probably millions of people dying.
And
tens of millions being homeless and having everything destroyed.
I can't imagine Taiwan using that as, maybe as a final last ditch. But honestly, I think it would be a bad strategic move for them for two reasons. One, I don't think killing millions of civilians doesn't prevent a dictatorial communist regime from going to war. It actually galvanizes the resolve.
But take a guess what city is downriver from the Three Gorges Dam.
No, I get it.
Shanghai is downriver.
I get it. This is also why I don't think they would do that, because I think, one, it would actually turn international opinion against them in many respects, and I think it would actually galvanize Chinese military efforts, because again, Thomas Sowell said this once, or was it Victor Davis? I can't remember. One of them said that, the thing about a democracy is whether you're winning or losing the war, when the voting public has decided you've lost, you've lost. That is not the case in a dictatorial communist regime, especially one that is being subjected to one-side propaganda of all of this. You would actually probably see a galvanization of the Chinese population. It would probably be, this sounds dark and weird, but it would probably be a help to Xi Jinping for something like that to happen, in order for him to maintain his grip on the country. Because now he would have a very, very discernible foreign threat that they could direct everyone's attention toward.
That would be a utter catastrophe, though, for the Chinese economy.
Oh, no question. But, it's amazing how these communists believe in things like, all these socialists believe in things like the broken window fallacy. Like, oh my gosh, look at all the devastation and destruction. Think of all the jobs that'll be created.
Yeah. You and I thought the exact same thing. Paul Krugman would be thrilled if Taiwan hit the Three Gorges Dam.
So let's look at a couple of the super chats here.
Nick, are we officially moving on to our Q&A section of the show?
Well, let's do this. I will finish this segment off by giving my opinion that I think China has a difficult enough time taking Taiwan by themselves, or taking Taiwan without any Western interference, which means even the most minimal contribution from the West, even if it's just material, even if it's just weapon systems, even if it's limited air and naval activity in order to ensure that China can't have complete naval and air dominance over the Taiwan Strait. I think that keeps the PRC from being able to launch a successful invasion. And to just answer one question somebody had in the chat, and that was, if we moved all the semiconductor construction over to the United States, would anybody care about Taiwan? And I would say that I think yes, there would still be people caring, because there's larger regional implications other than just the economic prowess of Taiwan and what their industry means to the West. But you really do have to hand it to the Taiwanese that they have become so effective and so essential in the industries that they have gotten good at as a nation, that they do. That lends its weight to the West's support for its autonomy and continued independence and operations. Okay.
So give a few guidelines here. We've got probably 30 minutes left. I've got about 10 questions that I've gathered throughout the stream. We've got 3 super chats. So we're going to roll right through these. Hopefully we'll be able to get to all of them. It really depends on how brief Nick decides to be with each of his responses. So we're going to start with 3 super chats here. Nick, do you want to read the first one from Professor Keen?
Sure. Well, the one we already did the one from 11 Bravo Crunchy. That was on the 2-month-long window of favorable tide and weather, which is a great point to bring up. Professor Keen says, speaking of good ranchers, there's not just chicken mouth and goatiplication. These were 2 shorts that I did on Instagram Reels. He goes, but rabbit exponents, cowgebra, and pigonometry.
Those are great.
He says those are pretty good. In fact, those might be some T-shirts coming right there. We'll send you one for free if we make those into t-shirts, Professor Keen. Thank you. Zim the Despot said, not going to make it to the Q&A, so I'll ask my question now. Is it a hot take to say that I am anti-war in the scene? I won't fight for the military-industrial complex. I don't think it's becoming an uncommon sentiment. And I will say this, like I'm skeptical of the military-industrial complex. Like I recognize the United States need to be able to develop sophisticated defense equipment. But there's also a huge incentive structure for the U.S. to get involved in wars. So because if you're making money off of the development of that equipment, well, then obviously war presents, kind of a boom period for you. And that can be problematic. And I think we always need to be very cognizant of that. Having said that, when it comes to fighting, my belief is that there is such a thing as just wars and there are unjust wars. And obviously, I have fought in a war before that I look back on now, and I think there was a lot of problems with it. That doesn't mean that I think the service that I rendered, the service that the people I was over there with rendered, was unjust or immoral. In fact, I think there was a lot of people that we helped. I think there was a lot of really, really bad people that we took out. I sleep very well at night, knowing that we helped kill a guy that used to put suicide vests on orphan children and detonate them in crowded marketplaces. I don't lose an ounce of sleep over that. I'm glad we can play a part. I hope he sought forgiveness right before he died, but that is what it is. So I think it's important. Like a lot of this stuff is a little bit more nuanced than sometimes it gets discussed, but no, I completely understand the sentiment of not wanting to get involved in wars, which seem like they serve no real security needs or purpose to the United States, that might be morally questionable for other reasons. And I also, more and more, I've become very frustrated with Congress completely absolving itself of its responsibility to vote to go to war. Instead, they just authorize budgets, and then we allow the chief executive to decide when and where we fight. And I don't think that's appropriate, nor do I think it's constitutional.
Okay. This first question is from Ollie. What would need to happen for this to become a regional or world war?
So I think, for the three scenarios that we talked with Russia and Ukraine, I don't see that becoming a larger regional war. I think I just don't see a scenario at this point where that becomes like, for instance, I don't see NATO invading Russia over Ukraine. I think that the analysis that Christian and I had with either it becoming a frozen conflict or a negotiated peace settlement where Russia keeps Crimea, Donbass ends up with some sort of autonomy within Ukraine, and probably a huge aid package to Ukraine. I think that's probably more likely. I at this point I don't even know what would happen unless Russia decided to invade somebody else. But I just don't think I don't think they're at capacity to do this right now. I think both sides kind of secretly want this thing to end sooner rather than later. Now, when it comes to Israel and Gaza, the thing that would cause a larger regional war is if in Israel's response to Gaza, there becomes an episode or an instance where countries like Egypt and especially Egypt feel like they need to get in the fight, or Iran decides to pop off and start launching missiles. That could start a larger regional war if a U.S. carrier gets hit by something that can be tied directly back to Iran. And by tied back to Iran, I mean tied back to Iran and all sides willing to acknowledge that it went back to Iran. There's been episodes where we've gotten little spats with other countries where we all agreed that, that happened by accident, right? In order to avoid a larger escalation of the conflict. But Iran directly sending ground forces in, that would cause, I think, a larger regional war that the United States would not be able to stay out of. I don't think it causes necessarily a world war. And honestly, if we did it correctly, and I know that sounds strange when we're talking about, war, but if we did it correctly, the United States would not invade Iran for the purpose of establishing a democracy or making the world, none of that crap. It would be a punitive expedition that would be, exclusively focused on decapitating senior political and military leadership within the Iranian regime and then destroying their ability to conduct offensive warfare. That would be it. And we could actually do that relatively simply with minimal with minimal danger to U.S. military forces. The real question would be what would be the Iranian response to the United States with respect to terrorist activity. But that one I could see being a regional war. And then if China did actually try to invade Taiwan, you would definitely see the United States get involved in that. But once again, to the extent that we would be looking at something like World War II or World War I, I don't think any of these present conflicts present a real probability of that happening anytime soon. In fact, I think you see more of a, like, if India and China finally just popped off and went to war, I think that would be the closest thing to seeing something on the scale of something like World War II. Because I do think other countries would get involved in that fight, to include the United States and others. So,
Go ahead, Christian.
Tyler asks, are you going to be covering the Myanmar coup in the present civil war? You know, that's an interesting one. There was everybody who's paid attention to what happened. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, we still call it that in the West most of the time. But everybody who's been paying attention to that probably remembers that video of the yoga instructor with the tanks rolling in the background, not realizing that there was a military coup going on.
A TikTok, and like the coup was moving in.
Burma has had a long history, I mean, ever since independence from the British, basically, of the military wanting to have a significant say in how their government operates. And whenever the military doesn't like what the government is doing, they usually overthrow them and then install a junta until they transition to democracy. And then it's been an endless cycle of the military overthrowing governments, having a junta, transitioning to democracy, only to then overthrow that democracy and then repeat the cycle all over again. Burma also, I believe, had a socialist government at the very tail end of the Cold War. There was actually significant protests in 1988 in Rangoon, over modern-day Yangon. They renamed the city. There was significant protests in the late 80s, similar to what was happening in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union and in Korea at the time, also in China with Tiananmen Square, that were brutally put down. And in many respects, what happened in 1988 is just continues to play out today. I mean, it's been, over 2 generations now since that happened, but the military has never really backed away from wanting to rule that country. Now, after the military staged that coup a few years ago, it basically started a civil war, but it's in some ways kind of a low-level civil war. The rebels only control kind of like the countryside, the hinterland. They don't have any sort of control over the major cities. The military junta has the weapons to fight a very brutal war. In fact, there was a few months ago a story of helicopters from the Myanmar Air Force flying in and firing rockets into a village because they thought that the rebel groups were operating in that village and killing hundreds of civilians. Now, because this is in a part of the world where unfortunately the West just doesn't really pay a lot of attention and doesn't really seem to care, because it's not, we've talked about this before, like there's some conflicts that for some reason the West is really engaged in, like Israel and Palestine or Russia and Ukraine, but they don't seem to be.
Well, it usually has to do with long-term cultural or strategic economic.
And there's just there doesn't seem to be a lot of strategic interest in what's going on in Burma.
I will say this though, if you want to learn some more about what's going on there, especially with the Karen rebels, Dave Eubank is a friend of mine. He runs the Free Burma Rangers, and some of the atrocities going on with the Karen people in Burma is just absolutely atrocious. And he does a lot of work in there providing medical assistance and whatnot for the people that are being subjected to it. But
it is a I mean, the civil war that's going on in Burma right now, when I said it's kind of low level in the hinterlands, that does not mean that it's not a brutal war. Like I believe it's like over 40,000 people have been killed in the civil war that's ongoing so far.
It's bad.
Okay, next question. I do have to apologize to a few folks. I didn't grab the handle for everybody's question. This one is, with the current trajectory of the war and possible escalation, do you think Israel might try to take the Temple Mount? John Stossel mentioned this in one of his most recent videos, but I doubt it.
I don't think they would, because if you wanted to turn this into a regional war that Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq would have to be involved in, take the Temple Mount and like destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, again, I understand. I certainly understand. Israel's desire to want to take that back, to potentially rebuild the temple. Like, I get all of that. I also think that this is the third holiest site in all of Islam. And so I don't think if taking the Temple Mount means going there leveling the Al-Aqsa Mosque and rebuilding the temple, yeah, that's war. There's no way.
That's when you get into Revelation stuff.
Yeah, there's no way the surrounding Arab countries would be able to tolerate that. And so I don't think Israel does it this time, but I don't know.
This one's from Bandit848, a longtime listener of the show. Of all the conflicts discussed, will it require an attack on the U.S. for us to actively engage in a war, or do you see a scenario of the U.S. going to war without an attack?
I don't think it requires an attack on U.S. soil. It would require attack on U.S. personnel or troops overseas. And there's a lot of them. we're in well over, I think, 150 countries around the world, and we're not just talking about like Marines at U.S. embassies. But no, I think a sufficiently horrible attack on a U.S. ship or U.S. troops overseas would definitely spark a U.S. military response. Here's the big question, though: is the response punitive? Or are we invading a whole country? Like, so for instance, we went into Iraq, we went into Afghanistan, and then all of a sudden fought the war and went into nation building. I would not have had nearly as big a problem with the U.S. response in Iraq and Afghanistan had it been far more focused on what we were there to do instead of this nation building garbage. Trump, when he launched operations into Syria, there was no, and now we're going to take over Syria and set up none of that. It was, nope, we're going to kill ISIS. So if we had U.S. military personnel hurt, wounded, I could see the United States responding in a punitive measure. I don't think it would necessarily be an all-out ground war where we would be primarily responsible in attempting to take over countries.
Next question. What do we think about the possibility of nukes via Iran or Israel?
Iran, I don't. So
Israel has nuclear weapons.
Israel has nukes. Israel's like official policy on nukes is ambiguity. They don't say they have them. They don't say they don't have them. But we all think they have between 80 to 400 nukes. Iran, we're not sure exactly what their potential nuclear capability. They've clearly been trying to develop it. I don't think Iran would have something like regional ballistic missiles. I don't know what their current nuclear capability is with something like that. There's also the idea of things like dirty nukes. It's the suitcase nukes and things like that are more tactical in nature, but would obviously do a lot of damage in a concentrated urban area. I don't put that past Iran. I think Iran is definitely one of those governments that makes decisions which don't appear rational to us because we have a very, very different worldview. By the same token, I don't think they're suicidal. And using nukes against Israel would be suicidal because we have gotten to a point where nukes are not seen as a first strike or an offensive weapon. Nukes are seen as a defensive capability, which is used to protect your own borders. And so I don't see Iran using them in an offensive setting because, once again, that would trigger a response not just from Israel, but from the United States. I also don't see Israel using nukes unless they really thought it was nukes.
It's only the Samson option.
Yeah. The only way they would use it is if they thought if you got them into a position where we use nukes or we don't exist as a state, Israel would use them. Iran would be, I think, a little bit more careless, but yeah.
Next question. Why would the U.S. need such a force in this area? Cannot Israel take care of things themselves, or are they looking for trouble?
That's a great question. So let's look at this from a generous interpretation of this action. Let's look at it from maybe a not so generous interpretation. That's the looking for trouble component. Israel does not require a U.S. carrier battle group in the Mediterranean. Now, keep in mind, we regularly keep carrier battle groups going through the Mediterranean, but they would not require that in order to defeat Hamas. I would go so far as to argue that they probably wouldn't require it to defeat Syria or Jordan or Lebanon or Egypt. The question becomes is what happens if all of these countries were to suddenly escalate all at once? The U.S. carrier's presence in the Middle East at this point is meant to signify to all the other countries in the region, let Israel and Hamas work this out. That's why you don't see the United States military sending ground troops. You don't see them launching flyovers or sorties in order to conduct airstrikes. And so I honestly believe that the Biden administration in this case believes that strong, unequivocal action at this point actually helps potentially de-escalate a situation where if it was just Israel, there would be more pressure to get involved from other countries. I think that's the generous interpretation of this, and I think that's a plausible interpretation. I don't think this is just me playing devil's advocate. I think it's a plausible interpretation. The other side of it is that if somebody does want war, well, then putting U.S. military personnel in close proximity to a conflict does present a possibility of, again, U.S. forces getting hurt, and the American people's tolerance for conflict tends to increase significantly when they feel like U.S. military personnel have been hurt or otherwise targeted in an inappropriate fashion. But I also think that there's a general war weariness in the United States that would not lend itself to any sort of full-scale invasion. So lower punitive actions maybe, but not full-scale invasion. That's just my take.
This question comes from David. He says, if you don't support the U.S. supporting Ukraine, do you support the U.S. supporting Israel?
So let's make some distinctions here. If you would have told me early on, should the United States, would the United States be willing to provide some military equipment or some aid to Ukraine against Russia, I probably would have had some tolerance for that. I don't think I wouldn't have had $100 billion in tolerance for it. Because I honestly believe that that's primarily an EU responsibility. Part of the reason why I say that is because I think really bad diplomacy led us up to this situation with Ukraine in the first place, and I think Europe is fully capable of providing sufficient material and resources in order to help Ukraine. So I kind of wonder, why is this our responsibility? The other part, too, is that the United States has no long-term relationship, alliances, agreements, major trade deals with Ukraine. Like Ukraine has never been in our sphere of influence. It's never been a close ally of the United States. In fact, for a significant portion of, of our history, Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union. It was actually arguably our enemy as a Soviet socialist republic within the USSR. Israel, on the other hand, has had a very, very different relationship. From its inception, the United States has considered Israel a strong ally in the region. That doesn't mean that Israel has always been a great ally. I think there's serious questions surrounding the USS Liberty that have never been sufficiently answered. And I think that's a huge problem. And I don't understand the why. For the life of me, I don't understand why that scenario went down the way it did. And so I think that's problematic. But I think it would be impossible to deny that the United States and Israel have actually shared very, very close diplomatic, economic relations. Israel, for a time, was our only ally, really, in the Middle East, with maybe the exception of Saudi Arabia and others, because there was such a long-term relationship with respect to oil. But Egypt, Syria.
You could argue that, Turkey when they joined NATO, but the problem is that Turkey is more pro-Turkey than anybody else.
Yeah.
Like they're kind of like the black sheep of NATO.
Yeah, so I guess what I say is that I don't think the United States should be on the hook to fight Israel's war for them. But rendering military aid to Israel makes more sense to me with respect to our overall strategic interests and long-term relationships and alliances than Ukraine does. Again, I could have gotten behind certain limited support for Ukraine. I got very frustrated with the way we went about that, in part because I feel like very bad diplomacy contributed to that situation. Whereas in the Middle East, we had actually been engaged in some pretty positive diplomacy over the last, honestly, it was during the Trump administration. And people look at that and they always thought Trump was going to start World War III. Trump actually did more to keep us out of wars. Regardless of what you think about him, regardless of what you think about his Twitter account, I'll say this as a combat vet. The one area with Trump before he got into office that I was a little bit concerned about was how was he going to conduct himself on an international stage? And what you found is he was loud and he was bombast, but people believed him when he said stuff. And I think it actually led to greater stability in many respects, because they knew Trump wasn't looking to invade countries and engage in nation building, but he also wasn't afraid to use the United States military for punitive actions when appropriate, and he would act quickly and decisively. And then he also created conditions where I think it became very easy for Middle Eastern countries to normalize relations with Israel. So, yeah.
This next question comes from a YouTube user by the name of Patriot. Is it good economically and politically to support Israel right now?
That's a good question. I think there's two things that we're talking about here. One is as us as individuals, and the other is as the United States. So one of the things that, and this is kind of more of a libertarian, non-interventionist, and maybe even bordering on isolationist idea, and that's the whole concept of friend to all, enemy to none unless you mess with us. And so the question is, and you saw this with George Washington too, about avoiding entangling alliances overseas and whatnot. Excuse me. And I think that's overall good advice. Having said that, we do have alliances. And I do think it can be somewhat, I think it can be just as it is naive to believe that the United States has a responsibility to the world's police force or to make the world safe for democracy or to invade countries and engage in nation building. I think it is also naive to believe that the United States should kind of just isolate itself and pretend like none of these regional conflicts affect it, especially when there's potentially major strategic economic implications based off of the region or the nations involved. And so I do believe that overall, I don't believe the United States should fight Israel's war for it. But I do believe supporting Israel in the sense that we want to de-escalate any sort of potential for a wider regional conflict, and that Israel knows that we will support it as a long-time friend and ally in the midst of a terrorist attack. I do think I think it's the morally correct thing to do, and I think ultimately it will be the politically correct thing to do, and potentially economically as well, as long as we can keep the situation contained. So I know that's kind of a difficult, nuanced answer, but I honestly think it's a nuanced situation. And there'll be plenty of people that will tell you, absolutely not, the United States should go in and commit military forces to protect Israel. There'll be other people to tell you that it's none of our business, stay out of it, let Israel deal with it. I think it's a little bit more complex in the region than either of those two options would present.
This question is from Mike. Should we emasculate Iran, i.e. turn their petro industry into glass and stop any nuke progress? Is that the head of the snake?
That's what Lindsey Graham thinks.
Tom Cotton probably has already done it he's probably playing Civ 6 right now, blowing up.
Here's the problem. Iran is going to continue to work to develop nuclear weapons until they eventually get one. And the reason why is because when you look at the history of countries that tried to get nuclear weapons or succeeded in getting nuclear weapons and then voluntarily gave them up, didn't really end very well. Uh-huh. Think about the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq worked to develop. Yeah. And then they got rid of them after the Gulf War. And then guess what happened? They still got invaded. Look at what happened with Ukraine after the end of the Soviet Union. Ukraine inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. They didn't need the world's third largest arsenal, but in retrospect, it probably would have been really smart for them to have a arsenal. Yeah. Instead, Ukraine unilaterally disarmed itself and handed over its nuclear weapons. Guess what happened after that?
By the way, to all the lefties with Ukrainian flags in their Twitter bios right now that encourage them to do it because unilateral disarmament's such a wonderful thing. Well, how about now? Still think that?
Look at Libya. Libya dismantled their weapons of mass destruction. They didn't have nuclear weapons, but they had chemical weapons. And then guess what happened? Gaddafi got overthrown and killed.
Yeah.
They got invaded as well. Not invaded, but they had a civil war that the West backed the rebels. And by the way, does that mean that I'm pro Gaddafi? No, of course not. Does that mean that I'm pro Saddam Hussein? No, of course not. I'm talking about realpolitik here.
Yeah.
When you look at countries that develop these WMDs and then dismantle them, either because they're required to, or it's too expensive, or they willingly choose to do so out of the kindness of their own hearts, whatever the reason is, history has shown us time and time and time again that countries that work to acquire these weapons and then give them up for whatever reason, it doesn't end well for those countries. And so Iran is looking at these countries and they're making the decision of, we have everything to gain and nothing to lose to develop these nuclear weapons. Everything to gain and nothing to lose. So we shouldn't be surprised at all. The precedent has been set around the world. Yes, they have a reason to develop nuclear weapons. We might disagree with the reason. We should disagree with the reason. I don't want the Ayatollah to have nuclear weapons, but they see this as a shield that can then be used to make sure that they will never be invaded by the West, ever, if they develop nuclear weapons.
I think the other thing, too, is because I've argued with libertarians on this one before where they're like, well, so the United States can have nukes, but Iran can't? Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Why? Well, because the United States doesn't have it in its charter that we can wipe out an entire people in order to bring about, revival. Right? I'm sorry, but the political leadership of Iran is dedicated to the ethnic cleansing of a particular region. If we can't logically sit here and say, okay, yeah, that means we might engage in some activities to prevent you ever getting nukes. Like, I'm sorry, at some point we're just being ridiculous. I don't know what sort of military operations that we should take with Iran. I was a little bit frustrated that when there was widespread kind of protests going on in Iran, I thought that would have been the time to potentially assist. And we see this every once in a while, and it's actually becoming more frequent in Iran where it's the people of Iran that are doing this. Here's what I would say. It is not the United States' obligation nor responsibility to interfere to such a degree where we go over there and we just, devastate their military and kill their political leaders and say, hey, we liberated you, go for it. I do place a high premium on people making their own decisions and essentially determining what risks they're going to take to secure their country. And I think it's sometimes dangerous for foreign powers, even when they think it's a bad regime, to go in there and displace that without any concept of what is going to replace it. And so I would be hesitant to say that the United States should go in there and just decapitate or emasculate Iran. I would say that if, by the same token, for those people that say, as long as they don't attack us, it's none of our business. Let's just face it. There's a lot of countries that we have long existing relationships with, trade relationships with, and everything else. And if Iran is engaging in aggressive action at the same time that they're attempting to develop nuclear weapons, we may be forced with the decision that it might be far more advantageous to launch punitive strikes now, which degrade that capability and perhaps add encouragement and to resistance groups operating within Iran than it would be to let them develop and just hope it works out all right. So again, I'm not someone that believes that just because a country poses a threat, it's time for the U.S. to invade. But I also don't take punitive military operations off the table when somebody signifies that they're willing to engage in offensive operations, especially if they could potentially become nuclear.
This question is from Esther, who actually sent her question in Hebrew. No, I cannot read Hebrew. Our good friend Cataphracts123 translated it for us in the chat. It says, question, are you not aware of the terror tunnels for Hamas? All of Gaza is a death trap.
Nope, I am. I certainly wouldn't say that I'm aware of them in the sense that somebody living in Israel is aware of them. You guys have been made aware of them many times over in some of the most horrendous ways possible, but I am absolutely aware that they exist. And from somebody that's had to conduct some degree, certainly not this intense, but some degree of urban warfare, I certainly understand what a problem it is for ground units as they're going in trying to clear this out while attempting to do their best to also protect non-combatants. And that's one of the reasons why I think Israel is being very careful with respect to how it's going to deploy its ground troops, is because I think Hamas wants a situation where civilians are put in impossible situations. The Israeli military are put in impossible situations where now you have to quickly decipher between somebody that's a non-combatant versus somebody that is posing a threat. And there will inevitably be decisions, some of them good, some of them bad in that scenario. And Hamas will use that for their propaganda efforts because, again, a lot of people in the West don't seem to understand the difference, make a moral equivalency argument, and unwittingly, I think, or maybe wittingly in some cases, encourage Hamas to use tactics like that. But no, you're absolutely right. The tunnel system is going to present huge problems for large-scale urban operations in Gaza.
This question is directed towards Christian from Jeffrey. He says, if the U.S. stops aid to Israel, can it survive?
Oh, definitely. I mean, Israel has one of the most formidable militaries.
And economies.
Israel's a very rich country. Yes. We give more foreign aid to Israel than any other country in the world. But here's the thing. The reason that I don't support foreign aid to Israel is not because I'm anti-Israel. It's because we're bankrupt. We're utterly bankrupt. We have over $33 trillion in debt, and we're running multi-trillion-dollar deficits. Why are we sending money to other countries? We've done whole podcasts before on here's what the future of America looks like from a monetary and fiscal perspective, and it ain't a pretty future. It's very, very bleak. Eventually, a day will come where it doesn't matter what Israel wants, doesn't matter what we want. The money won't be going to Israel because there literally won't be any money to send them. Because eventually we're going to have to turn the money printer on in order to fund Congress's reckless spending habits. And when that happens, hyperinflation is inevitable. So I mean, the reason that I want to end foreign aid, certainly cash payments of foreign aid. Now, you can argue that military equipment is separate from that. That's a very legitimate argument to make, and you can have a discussion about that. And I'm not necessarily against supplying military equipment to countries, but direct financial assistance to countries, there's no money for that. It's as simple as that. And unfortunately, there's no appetite to cut any sort of spending in Washington, D.C., and disaster is inevitable at this point. We just don't know when it's going to happen. So I hope that answers the question. I hope that, I mean, that's kind of a doomer answer, but somebody in the chat actually said that Nick and Christian are perfect for playing off of each other because one's too optimistic and then the one's too pessimistic. So
if you listen to both of us, you might get the most likely outcome.
This question is from Intensive Care Bear on the MTA channel.
Hey, Intensive Care Bear, how you doing?
Long-time listener. Why do you think that this discussion around Israel is so disconnected from all other military conflicts? I can't think of any other conflicts that are spoken about in this way.
I think, I think it's especially spoken of this way in the United States and in the West in general. I think it has a couple of reasons. One, it is something of a strategic portion of the area because of oil. I think it's also a major issue because Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are three of the most influential religions in all of world history. And if you look at the West in the United States, predominantly Christian, a lot of Christians, I would argue, especially evangelical Christians, look at Israel and look at the promises that God provides to Israel, especially in the Old Testament, as something of a modern day duty. Now, there's different theological debates on whether or not that remains in play, but regardless, I think there's still a connection as Christians see the Levant and Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee as Holy Land. So when three of the major world religions see a particular area as not only strategic terrain but sacred, I think that's why the discussions around conflicts in this area and aid to this area and the composition of it is different than what we might say kind of traditional questions of conquest or defense. I think that has a lot to do with it. And then obviously I think I think the Holocaust also has something to do with it. And the way things were decided in 1947 and 48. So I think all of those things going all the way back to Abraham explain why we look at conflicts surrounding Israel differently than we look at other world conflicts.
I wasn't planning to get to this question, but I think it's on everyone's mind, so I'm going to ask it. This one's from Samantha on the MTA channel. With Hamas calling for worldwide activation, do you think a home soil attack is likely or possible?
So there was some confusion on what they were actually calling for. There was some that said it was a global day of jihad. There was some that were saying it was a global day of protest. I think some media outlets probably went with whatever they thought was the better clickbait on that one. There's been a lot of concern about people coming over the southern border. I said this last time, and I think a lot of people are probably going to disagree with me on this. I don't think Islamic motivated terrorism or even Middle Eastern motivated terrorism is the most significant threat within the United States or coming over our southern border. I think it's far more having to do with criminal activity, human trafficking, fentanyl, things like that. That's not to say that people wouldn't use a weak border in order to infiltrate the United States and set up sleeper cells and things of that nature. Regardless of how you feel about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'm very skeptical of a lot of the things that we did, not everything, but a lot of the things that we did significantly degrade the capability of international terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, et cetera. So I think it's something that we should be vigilant toward. But I don't know that, again, if you're looking at what are the objectives here, if the objective is to create a scenario where Israel conducts operations in such a way as to diminish the peace process in the Middle East, I don't know that Iran or Hezbollah or these other terrorist groups contribute to that mission by attacking the United States right now. Because ultimately, even though we might be war weary, even though we might be frustrated with the last decades in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you kill a bunch of Americans, we're gonna respond to that, and we're gonna respond in a way that is heavily punitive. And I don't know that furthers any of their obligations or any of their objectives. Having said that, you never know when you're dealing with somebody that is just crazy enough because they believe it's going to kick off the return of whatever. So that's the concern. And again, it's one of the reasons why there's multiple reasons to secure the southern border. That is one of the most important, as long as we just keep in mind that there's other ways that people could potentially infiltrate if they wanted to hurt the United States. And I don't think we're going to see widespread terror attacks in the U.S. as a result of what's going on. What I'm more concerned about at this point is some of the domestic terrorism that could potentially take place, maybe not in the form of, like a 9/11, but I am concerned about potential rioting, potential people being harmed. I'm concerned about Jews within the United States specifically being targeted, not so much by, again, international terrorists that have come to the United States, but actually by people here within the United States that might be a part of extremist communities.
We have the lunatics have taken over the asylum within American academia. Like, there's so many videos of universities and even high schools at this point of just.
I'm more worried about them than I am people like. I'm more worried about them than I am someone coming into the United States for the express purpose of detonating a bomb underneath the Capitol.
I'm more worried about Americans in my country who believe that I need to be decolonized.
Yeah.
Than I am Hamas sending somebody over who's going to cross over from Mexico or Canada.
Yeah. I'm more worried about some of the people that you see showing up to some of these protests. Not everyone that shows up to protest. I disagree with them, but they're welcome to protest as long as they do it peacefully. But I'm very concerned about anybody that seems to think. I'm concerned about, again, left-wing academics in the United States standing up, talking about how wonderful it is that Hamas launched this attack and how encouraged they are by it. Those are the sort of people that are willing to justify violence, and they're willing to do it domestically.
This question is from Rocky Tom.
Hey, Rocky.
In 1933, one war, Sino-Japanese, wasn't enough to start World War II. What kind of 1939 Poland events today could turn two wars, Ukraine and Israel, into a global war? Seems that we're close.
I actually don't think we're close to a world war.
I don't either.
I think so many people like to talk about it because we live in an age where hyperbolic rhetoric is what drives online content a lot, especially in places like YouTube or places like Twitter, X. Having studied a lot of history in this time period, the world wars, Bismarck was in many respects a genius because he was able to predict events that took place over 20 years after his death.
Yeah.
And he said, near the end of his life, he said something along the lines of, we're sitting on a powder keg, and while I can't tell you when it will happen, I can tell you what will be the spark that will cause a general European war. It'll be some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. And he was totally right.
Yeah.
But and he made some other predictions too. He said something like, the Battle of Jena took place about 20 years after the death of Frederick the Great. At the pace we're going, the great collapse of the German Empire will take place 20 years after my death. And he was right literally almost to the day.
Yeah.
But it's actually quite rare in history for somebody to kind of have that level of brilliance when it comes to understanding geopolitics to make such accurate predictions. There's not a lot of Bismarcks in the world, and I certainly don't pretend to be one. But I will say that also works in reverse. So a lot of these people that are going out there saying a world war is inevitable, this is going to happen. Like I remember as a kid, people talking about things like that. After the after the Iraq War started, people thought, is this going to be a world war? No. It's usually world wars are caused by accidents. So for example, the 7 Years' War, you could argue that was a world war.
Yeah.
That was caused by a minor boundary dispute in the Ohio River Valley.
Well, let me.
When you look at World War I, that was caused by, first you had two Balkan wars before that, and then the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Serbia. These things that people just nobody could possibly predict, with few exceptions, that Englishmen would be shipped off to fight in Flanders alongside the French against Germans because they invaded Belgium after a Serb shot an Austrian in Sarajevo, Bosnia. That is a black swan event. So I actually think that all of these localized conflicts, either currently or frozen, that are going on around the world are probably not going to be the thing that would kick off a larger global conflict.
Here's what I'll say. And we've talked about this before when we talked about what is the likelihood of a national divorce within the United States or conflict within the United States. And it goes to this. It's a combination of conditions with a catalyst. right? So the conditions have to be present for something like that to take place. And then it's the catalyst. That's the spark, right? That's the powder keg. We did not have World War I because Archduke Ferdinand was shot. We had World War I because we had a lot of countries that distrusted each other with huge industrial militaries, long disputes, long histories of war and conflict with one another. And everyone kind of poised for something, and then all of a sudden that happens, and then you have a series of other catalysts that take place as well that lead to something being inevitable. But whenever people look back, I'm like, oh, if only I saw someone this the other day, like, if only Archduke Ferdinand had taken a different route, World War I never would have happened. Yeah, it probably would have, because the conditions were there. It just would have been a different catalyst. And so the point that I look at right now is that I see a lot of conditions for regional war. I don't see a lot of conditions for world war, if we're talking about world war in the sense of like what we saw in World War I and World War II, where the world's major powers were in full mobilization. Right? That doesn't mean that if a bunch of world powers are engaging in various punitive actions throughout the world and stuff like that, does that meet the definition of world war? Maybe, but not in the way that we think about it.
Yes.
And so I don't think the conditions are there for the sort of World War III scenario where everyone's fully mobilized and we're all drafting our populations and we're rationing foods because we need more money, or we need more money for artillery
You're
shells.
more likely to see a Cold War II than a World War III.
Yeah. I think that's accurate.
There's some economists, especially that are like more in the Austrian school, have talked about in the last few years about deglobalization.
Yeah.
And you could certainly make the argument that we're moving towards deglobalization. You're seeing a return more to like the 1930s and 40s in terms of like monetary policy and also foreign relations. But that doesn't mean world war. That means the long peace that they've that's been coined since the end of World War II, where great nations do not fight each other. You see localized conflicts, right? But you do not see,
because the consequences with nuclear weapons made it so different.
And so that's ushered in the Great Peace. But that's kind of been an outlier in the grand scheme of history. There's been, before the World Wars, there were conflicts all the time, but they were not necessarily world wars in the full scale industrial sense of World War I and II. So I used the 7 Years' War, for example. That what you could argue was a world war, but it was not full total mobilization. We're rationing things, that type of stuff. I don't think we're heading in that direction.
I think we're going to see a lot of regional conflicts. I think some of them could be quite large. Like I think you could see a large regional conflict between China and India. I don't know to what scale. I don't know what extent.
You could see one between Ethiopia and Egypt, for example.
You could, especially with the Aswan Dam and everything. Or no, not with the Aswan Dam.
The dam that the Ethiopians are constructing.
Yeah. You could see some major regional conflicts. Africa right now, we're seeing coups. There's been something like 7 coups over the last year and a half.
There's been an uptick over again, that long peace has meant fewer civil wars and fewer regional conflicts since World War II. You're seeing a reversal of that. And I actually think that'll continue as part of this deglobalization pattern. But just because you might see more coups or civil wars or even inter-country wars on a more localized level, either between minor powers or regional powers, I do not think the great powers of the world are going to be going to war where the sense that nuclear weapons are...
But most of them don't have the capacity for it. Like Germany is not looking to go into a major war. France is not looking to go into a major war. England's not looking to go into a major war. The United States has the capability for it, but honestly, we're so in debt. Our inflationary problem is bad, and our people are so war weary. We're not looking to do it. China's in a situation that's rough because, again, dictatorial communist regime with major problems at home. Yeah, that's a recipe for some regional problems, but I don't think it necessarily pulls the whole world into a world war. Because the consequences of it also become a lot bigger when we look at the technology factor. When the United States went to war with Iraq in the first Gulf War, the amount of damage that we did in such a short period of time demonstrated something that I don't think the world was ready for. And that was this. Technology mismatches between militaries is significant. People have this problem of saying, you've got 2 million men, we've got 1 million men, so you've got a 2-to-1 advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, a conscript with an AK-47 and 60 rounds is not the equivalent of a U.S. Army infantryman with an M4 and 210 rounds and night vision and body armor and a whole combined and everything else, and an IR laser on their weapon that they can see at night that their enemies can't see. Like I can't even express to people the total mismatch to where if you're just looking like, well, they've got 1,000 tanks and we've only got 500. Yeah, but if our tanks can kill yours a mile before they can engage, we win. Right? This is not something where, okay, well, 1 million men fighting 500,000 men, but the 500,000 men are better trained. Well, maybe the 500,000 pull it out, but the 1 million men kill half of them. Nope. And this goes throughout all of history. Let me put it this way, and I'll take it all the way back to history, but then I'm gonna show you a modern example as well. When Darius was putting together his army to fight Alexander the Great, he was pulling people out of the fields, giving them a spear and a wicker shield to go up against armored hoplites. Now, it didn't matter that if he had 1,000 for every 100 Alexander had. There wasn't even that big a mismatch. But it doesn't matter because it's not something where, well, there's a certain degree of quantity that overrides your quality. That's only true if the mismatch isn't so defined that you're overwhelmed, because what happens is when you send in the first 100 troops and they get massacred, I don't care if you've got 5,000 more looking on or 5,000 more to go. They just saw what happened to the first 100 you sent in. That devastates morale. At the end of the day, these are not robots with equipment going into combat. They're people, and they don't want to die. And I've talked to Iraqi soldiers that were there during the first Gulf War. They outnumbered us significantly. And you ask them, so what happened when you were driving your truck in the Iraqi army? They're like, I got out of my truck, I raised my hands, and I just started walking toward American lines. Why? Because they saw the absolute devastation that we could wreak. You can't just look at person for person, tank for tank. Again, if our tank can kill your tank a mile before it can engage ours, it doesn't matter that you outnumber me 5-1. Because my one will take out most of yours before they even arrive on the battlefield. And once they see me take out a quarter of your forces, the rest of them are going to get the hint that this ain't a fight we want. When I can destroy your Air Force within the first month of the conflict and maintain in complete air superiority, this is not a 1-for-1 match just because you have a jet and I have a jet. So it's just important to make that distinction here. I think we got one more question, then we'll close it out here.
Why don't you read it to close us off, Nick?
Question from Roya Turo. Sorry if I got that wrong. I have one question. Is China practicing on the Philippine Islands, particularly the Spratly Islands? Is it Spratly or Spratly? In order for them to properly invade Taiwan, they already took a lot from the Philippines. No, I don't think so. I think the only reason why China has kind of pushed into that region is because, one, they know that the Philippines don't have the capacity to stop them from doing it. Two, that's like an oil-rich environment. The whole reason for them looking at I thought it was the Spartleys. Maybe I'm wrong. The whole reason for them to do that is because they want to be able to make a long-term claim to the mineral resources or to the oil resources, which everyone believes is present within that particular area. It's not as if they've launched complex amphibious operations that they could then turn around and utilize for Taiwan. So I think that's more of a strategic economic play for them. And then you could also argue that if they can get international recognition for their control of that area, they can expand international recognition for the amount of seed that they control along a very strategic trade route. But I don't think it offers them any sort of relevant training experience or occupation experience that would help them with Taiwan, if that answers the question.
We have one last super chat from Joey. Off topic, but your opinion on disenfranchisement and loss of gun rights for felons after they have completed their sentence and paid for their crimes, in light of Israel's change to their gun policy after the attack. Thanks.
Yeah, isn't it amazing how things like that change? So for me, it's always kind of dependent on why did you get your felon, or why did you get your felony? So if you got your felony as a result of hurting someone, especially if you got your felony as a result of hurting someone with a firearm, I am far less likely to just automatically give you your rights back. I don't believe in automatic restoration for that. Because here's the idea. The idea is that, will you have paid your debt to society? Okay. Have you paid your debt to the victim? Like if you murder someone, you can't ever repay that debt. And I find it a little bit disingenuous when the state claims that, oh, well, you've repaid your debt to us. Cool. They didn't murder the state. They murdered someone's kid. And so I'm not very hot and heavy to give to do automatic restoration of rights. Now, can there be scenarios where somebody committed a felony at some point in their life and have demonstrated either through time served and through, maybe they didn't murder anyone, they didn't physically hurt anyone, but they still got a felony? Can they demonstrate over time that they should be able to get those rights back? Yes, but I think there should be a process for that. I don't think it should be automatic restoration. So I hope that answers that question. There was one more. Isaac asked, I joined super late, but what do you think about Hamas trying to manipulate BLM into joining them in their cause? Isaac, I don't think BLM.
They don't need to manipulate.
I don't think BLM required manipulation. And the reason why, and this goes back to something that we talked about with Israel, when we're looking at these different organizations that are supporting Hamas, and you look at what is the common thread? Like, for instance, why would somebody in their right mind hold up a sign that says Queers for Palestine when if the Palestinians actually had a state, there would be no pride parades going through the middle of downtown? Right? Why would that happen? And it's because ultimately this is not about intellectual consistency with respect to these individual movements. The West, this ideology, James Lindsay has a couple of really interesting talks where he calls it Maoism with American characteristics and intersectionality being the fundamental philosophy which informs it. It's this idea that you have these various groups that are anti-West, anti-capitalist, and those are your allies, regardless if you disagree on other topics. If they're anti-Western, if they're anti-capitalist, those are your allies, because at the root of a lot of these organizations is Marxism. BLM used to be very, very upfront about it. The founders of BLM used to talk about how they were proud trained Marxists. And so if your underlying ideology is Marxism, and part of a species of Marxism isn't focused so much on the economic side, but rather the identity side, then all of a sudden, people holding up signs that say Queers for Palestine or BLM supporting Hamas, all of a sudden that makes perfect sense because it's part of like this underlying ideology that doesn't feel any need to be internally consistent with their overall values, because the objective is the accumulation of political power. And if Hamas is useful for them right now in the accumulation of that political power, well, then so be it, because after all, decolonization and anti-West and anti-capitalism, because ultimately those are the true enemies for them. And so I don't think they required a great deal of convincing, because I think fundamentally it fits within their overall objectives as an organization. All righty, we went, gosh, almost 2 hours and 40 minutes today. I want to thank you for sticking with us. We went through a lot of complex targets. Our whole objective that we started off the show with was to give everyone kind of a brief overview of two of the major conflicts that are currently going on. One of the major conflicts that is something that a lot of people have discussed and many people think is going to happen within a relatively short period of time, and then to answer your questions on any other conflicts that we weren't able to cover. And I hope what we did was give people a good understanding of some of the implications, some of the reasoning that has been used for all these conflicts, some of the reasons why early predictions in these wars didn't turn out the way they did. I hope we also did a good job on justifying our own claims on why we think certain things happened, why we think certain things may result in a particular outcome, and why we think certain things are not going to happen despite some of the more grandiose or hyperbolic claims that are being made on other sites. And again, we always appreciate the fact that you can always be proven wrong tomorrow with any of your predictions, but I hope if you're watching, you can at least walk away with some confidence that the analysis that we gave you today was based on objective facts and reality. It was also based on a lot of research as well as some personal experience, and that it was at least logically consistent within its application, and hopefully provide some insight into what's going on, what will happen, and hopefully what won't happen in the future. Once again, thank you all for joining us. Please consider joining that circle chat. And if you are one of the people that have not yet ordered from Good Ranchers, do us a favor, and more importantly, do yourself a favor and order yourself some Good Ranchers. Promo code Nick, $25 off and free shipping. Go in and give it a try, and then let me know. If you think I'm wrong, come onto this chat and just light me up. But I won't be. I won't be wrong. You'll be saying thank you. And I'll be saying thank you because you supported the show by also getting something from Good Ranchers. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.